Imagine facing a winter night in the 1700s with no firewood, no coal, and nothing but a threadbare blanket for warmth. Across Europe, the poor endured brutal winters in silence, shivering in stone cottages, starving as crops failed, and burning anything they could find just to stay alive. Hunger gnawed at bellies, disease followed cold, and entire families disappeared into the statistics of famine. This is the story of those forgotten voices, the millions who endured winter not with comfort, but with desperation and survival. The 18th century was a period when the rhythm of life was dictated not by machines or global trade, but by the seasons. For the majority of Europe's population, who lived as peasants, laborers, and the urban poor, winter was not a picturesque landscape of frost and snow. It was a deadly adversary. In an era before modern heating, insulated housing, or centralized welfare systems, cold weather meant not only discomfort, but the constant threat of hunger, illness, and death. The poor were the most exposed, and the long winters of the 1700s became synonymous with hardship and survival. Winters in the 18th century were harsher than those experienced in many later periods because Europe was still in the grip of what historians call the Little Ice Age. This climatic period, stretching from roughly the 14th to the mid-19th century, brought colder temperatures, unpredictable storms, and shortened growing seasons. Severe winters were not the exception. They were a recurring ordeal. Ice frequently blocked rivers, snow lingered for weeks, and frost penetrated deep into the soil. For peasants who lived at the edge of subsistence, even a few weeks of extra frost could mean famine. The following year, the harshness of winter was compounded by fragile housing. The poor lived in cottages or tenements built of stone, timber, or clay, with thatched or shingled roofs that offered little insulation. Windows, when present at all, were often covered with oiled paper rather than glass, letting in draughts of icy air. Floors were sometimes packed earth rather than wood, absorbing moisture and chill. In Northern Europe, cottages might include a central hearth, but even then, heat dissipated quickly. Families often huddled together in a single room, not out of choice but necessity. In southern regions, stone houses trapped cold at night, offering little relief. Fuel was another critical problem. Firewood was the most common source of heat, but forests were already under pressure from deforestation, shipbuilding, and urban demand. In many places, wood had become prohibitively expensive for the poor. Alternatives, such as peat or dried dung, were used when available, but supplies were uncertain. Coal, increasingly common in England, was still inaccessible for much of continental Europe's poor, either due to high costs or lack of infrastructure. Without adequate fuel, fires burned low or not at all, and nights were endured with little more than blankets of straw. Clothing offered scant protection. Wool was the most common fabric, but it was costly, and many poor families could not afford thick garments. Children often wore patched hand-me-downs, while adults layered rags to trap warmth. Leather shoes, when available, wore through quickly, leaving feet exposed to snow and dampness. In rural areas, cloaks or capes were fashioned from whatever materials were at hand, yet they did little to keep out the biting winds. The wealthy might wrap themselves in fur, but the poor faced winter with little more than threadbare coats. Food scarcity was the most severe consequence of winter. Agricultural cycles left little fresh produce available between harvests, and stored grain was often insufficient. In years when harvests had already been poor due to frost, flood, or blight, The hungry months of late winter and early spring became catastrophic. Bread, the staple of diets across Europe, rose in price as supplies dwindled. Peasants who lived hand-to-mouth during summer and autumn found themselves without reserves. In France, the phrase "le temps de la soudure," the time of welding, described the desperate period when old stores were exhausted and the new harvest was still months away. Malnutrition was pervasive. Diets in winter often consisted of thin soups, coarse bread, and whatever preserved foods could be stored. Meat was rare, milk supplies declined when cattle produced less in the cold, and fresh vegetables were almost non-existent. Malnourished bodies became more vulnerable to disease, and children, in particular, suffered stunted growth or death from weakened immunity. Starvation did not always appear as dramatic mass die-offs, but as slow attrition, swollen bellies, thin faces, and the gradual collapse of health. Disease followed cold and hunger with ruthless efficiency. In overcrowded urban housing, frost drove people indoors, where poor ventilation and dampness bred illness. Respiratory diseases such as pneumonia and tuberculosis claimed countless victims. Epidemics of typhus and influenza often flared during winters, when populations were weakened. In rural areas, the lack of medical care meant even minor illnesses could be fatal. Winter was therefore the season not only of hunger but of burials, with parish records showing dramatic spikes in deaths. Every year during the cold months, the psychological toll was equally severe. For those living in poverty, winter symbolized endurance rather than festivity. Diaries and parish accounts speak of people dreading the season, counting the days until spring. The rhythm of life slowed to a crawl, with work limited by darkness and cold. Idleness, however, did not mean rest. It meant less income for laborers, less food on the table, and a deepening spiral of poverty. Begging increased in towns and cities, as the destitute sought warmth in churches, barns, or roadside ditches. Many did not survive until spring. Winter also exposed the sharp inequalities of 18th century Europe. The wealthy retreated to well-stocked homes, with ample fuel, imported foods, and servants to manage comfort. By contrast, the poor endured the brunt of cold with little support. Relief systems, when they existed, were inadequate. Parishes distributed bread or firewood, and charitable societies sometimes set up soup kitchens, but demand always outstripped supply. In many regions, survival depended on community solidarity, neighbors sharing meager resources, families pooling labor to gather fuel, or villagers banding together to care for orphans and widows. The 1700s also witnessed notorious episodes when winter turned catastrophic. The Great Frost of 1709, which froze rivers and destroyed crops across Europe, revealed the extreme vulnerability of the poor. Eyewitnesses in France described peasants burning furniture to survive, while in Poland, entire villages were abandoned. Even in years without such extreme events, winter mortality was high, and famine remained a lurking threat. The poor had no margin of safety, and each harsh winter reinforced their precarious place in society. Despite suffering, winter survival practices emerged. Families insulated cottages with straw stuffed in cracks, shared sleeping spaces to preserve warmth, and scavenged for any burnable material. Food preservation techniques, drying, salting, fermenting, were crucial, though only partially effective. Communities developed rhythms of endurance, fasting through the leanest weeks, stretching supplies with thin gruel, and relying on faith or ritual to give meaning to hardship. Survival was never guaranteed, but cultural memory of suffering created strategies that were passed down across generations. By the end of the 18th century, small improvements began to alter winter survival. Expanding coal industries in England provided fuel for growing numbers of households, though not the poorest. Agricultural innovations gradually increased yields, and governments slowly recognized their responsibility to regulate grain markets and provide relief. Yet these changes did little to erase the memory of a century when winter was an annual trial of survival. The harsh face of winter in the 1700s was not merely about weather, it was about poverty. Cold, hunger, and disease disproportionately affected the poor because they lacked the means to shield themselves. Each winter became a test of endurance, exposing the fragility of life and the deep inequalities of early modern Europe. For the poor, winter was not just a season on the calendar. It was a recurring battle against nature, fought with inadequate tools and dwindling strength. For the poor of 18th century Europe, home was not a refuge from the cold, but a fragile shell against it. Unlike the great estates, palaces, and townhouses of the wealthy, the dwellings of peasants, laborers, and the urban poor were built for necessity, not comfort. The phrase stone walls, straw beds captures the essence of this world. Bare structures, makeshift furnishings, and constant exposure to dampness and cold. To understand why winters were so deadly for the poor, we must first step inside these homes, into spaces that were less shelter than survival chamber. In rural Europe, the majority of poor families lived in cottages. These were usually single-room or two-room structures, built of whatever materials were most abundant locally. In England, cottages were often waterlandorp, wooden frames packed with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. In Scotland and Ireland, stone walls were common, but roofs were thatched with reeds or heather that let in drafts and moisture. In Central and Eastern Europe, timber houses with clay-packed walls were typical. Construction was crude and rarely weatherproof. Wind whistled through gaps, rain and snow seeped in, and in winter, the cold was ever present. Floors were frequently made of compacted earth. In wet weather, they became muddy. In winter, they turned hard and icy. Few households could afford wooden planks, and rugs or carpets were luxuries of the elite. To soften the ground, straw or rushes were spread across floors, periodically replaced when soiled. These rushes absorbed dirt, waste, and damp, creating a breeding ground for vermin. For the poor, this was normal. The floor beneath their feet was both bedding for animals and material. Insulation against the chill, sleeping arrangements reflected the same austerity. Beds, when present, were simple wooden frames or straw-filled mattresses. Many families slept directly on heaps of straw, with rough woolen blankets or patched quilts as covering. It was common for entire households to sleep together in a single bed or pile, conserving warmth by sharing body heat. Children, parents, and sometimes grandparents pressed together under thin coverings, while livestock might be brought indoors to generate additional warmth. The idea of privacy was foreign to these dwellings. Survival took precedence over comfort. Light was scarce, particularly in winter when daylight hours were short. Candles were expensive, and the poor often relied on rushlights, reeds dipped in tallow that burned dimly and produced smoke. Open hearths provided both light and warmth, but smoke often filled the room, as chimneys were rudimentary or absent. Blackened walls and persistent coughing were signs of the smoky interiors in which people lived. Fireplaces, when present, were small, and fuel was rationed carefully. Fires were allowed to die at night to conserve wood, leaving interiors freezing by morning. Urban poor faced similar or worse conditions. In cities like Paris, London, or Vienna, laborers crowded into tenements, tall, narrow buildings divided into cramped rooms. Overcrowding was extreme, with multiple families sharing a single space. Ventilation was poor, sanitation inadequate, and cold intensified by damp walls. In London's East End, reports describe families sleeping packed together like herrings in rooms with broken windows patched by rags or paper. The cold in such places was less about wide open spaces and more about the drafty, damp structures that trapped misery. Furniture was sparse. A poor household might own a table, a few stools, and a chest for belongings. Beds were rare luxuries, and chairs with backs almost unknown. Cooking was done in iron pots suspended over open fires, with little in the way of utensils. Storage was limited. Food, when available, was often hung from rafters or kept in simple wooden bins. Walls were bare except for religious icons or crude decorations. In winter, interiors were stripped down to their most functional state, places to sleep, eat, and wait for the cold to pass. Vermin thrived in these conditions. Rats and mice were constant companions, drawn by food scraps and straw bedding. Fleas and lice infested clothing and mattresses, spreading disease. In winter, infestations worsened as animals sought shelter indoors. Accounts from parish visitors and reformers often mention the overwhelming presence of filth in poor homes, not from laziness, but from the impossibility of maintaining cleanliness with inadequate materials, and constant exposure to damp. Health consequences were severe. Damp walls bred respiratory illness, while poor ventilation exacerbated conditions like tuberculosis. The cold made rheumatism and joint pain widespread, and the lack of sanitation encouraged outbreaks of typhus and dysentery. Infant mortality was especially high, as newborns could not survive the freezing interiors of cottages and tenements. For mothers, childbirth in such conditions was perilous, as infections spread easily in damp, crowded quarters. The home, far from being a refuge, was itself a source of danger. Despite this, homes were also places of community and resilience. Families improvised ways to make their spaces livable. Straw was stuffed into cracks in walls to block drafts. Rags were hung over doorways. In some areas, people used clay or dung to patch gaps in walls and roofs. Ingenuity extended to sleeping. Families built box beds, wooden, enclosures that trapped warmth, or used curtains around beds to conserve heat. These measures did not eliminate cold, but they provided marginal improvements in survival. Religious and cultural practices often centered on the hearth. Even in the poorest cottages, the fire was the symbolic heart of the home. Families gathered around it for warmth, meals, and prayers. The hearth became the focal point of winter life, its small flames representing continuity in the face of bitter cold. When fuel ran short, households faced the devastating silence of an extinguished hearth, a sign of both physical danger and spiritual desolation. Regional variations also shaped experiences. In Northern and Eastern Europe, where winters were harshest, homes were often partially built into the earth, using soil as insulation. In Scandinavia, turf roofs helped retain heat. In alpine villages, multi-level homes allowed animals to be kept on the ground floor, with human families above, warmed by rising heat. Yet even these adaptations could not prevent hardship when resources failed. In southern Europe, Winters were milder, but still deadly to the poor, especially in mountainous areas, where snow blocked access to markets and fuel. The divide between rich and poor was most visible in winter interiors. Aristocrats enjoyed thick tapestries, multiple fireplaces, and feather-filled beds. Merchants and professionals lived in sturdy townhouses with glazed windows and stockpiled firewood. The poor, by contrast, faced bare walls, damp brushes, and straw bedding. This inequality was not only physical but psychological, reinforcing the distance between classes. For reformers and clergy, the sight of poor dwellings became a moral lesson, inspiring calls for charity, though rarely systemic change. The 18th century saw some attempts at reform. In England, philanthropists like Jonas Hanway documented the misery of poor housing, advocating for better living conditions. In France, Enlightenment thinkers linked poverty to structural inequality, highlighting the role of environment in suffering. Yet practical changes were slow. Industrialization in the late 18th and early 19th centuries would eventually transform urban housing. But for much of the 1700s, the poor remained trapped in inadequate homes that magnified the dangers of winter. To understand the survival of Europe's poor in the 18th century, one must imagine nights spent in such spaces. Families lying shoulder to shoulder on straw, breathing smoke-filled air, listening to the wind rattle through walls patched with clay. The home was less a defense against winter than a fragile pause in the relentless assault of cold. Stone walls and straw beds were not symbols of security. They were emblems of endurance in a world where poverty left little room for comfort. For the poor of the 18th century, hunger was not a passing discomfort. It was a constant companion, a gnawing reminder of scarcity that defined daily life, and in winter it became unbearable. The cold did not just chill bones, it stole the means of survival, stripping fields bare, emptying barns, and driving food prices beyond the reach of the poor. To speak of poverty in the 1700s is to speak of hunger, and winter was its cruelest season. Bread lay at the center of this struggle. Across Europe, bread was the staple food for peasants and laborers, often providing more than half of daily caloric intake. In France, wheat bread was the ideal, though the poor often subsisted on rye or barley loaves. In parts of Germany, black bread made from rye or mixed grains dominated. In Ireland, oats were central, while in Eastern Europe, millet and rye supplemented diets. Whatever the grain, bread was life itself. When prices rose or harvests failed, famine became inevitable. The winter months were always precarious because they stretched food reserves to their limit. Harvests came in late summer and autumn, and what was stored had to last until the next year. For wealthy landowners, granaries were filled with surplus. For the poor, reserves were minimal. Families measured the season by how long their stores of grain, dried vegetables, and salted meat would last. Once these were exhausted, survival depended on markets. But in years of scarcity, markets offered little hope. Failed harvests were common in the 1700s, especially during the colder years of the Little Ice Age. Early frosts killed crops before they ripened. Wet summers rotted grain in the fields. Droughts withered plants before they could be harvested. Each climatic shock reverberated into the following winter. A poor harvest meant not just less food, but higher prices, as competition for limited grain intensified. The poor, living from day to day, could not afford the inflation that followed. Records from France reveal how devastating these shortages could be. In 1709, the infamous Great Frost destroyed vineyards, orchards, and fields across the kingdom. Wheat prices tripled, and bread became inaccessible to common people. Contemporary accounts describe peasants boiling nettles, bark, and acorns into paste to survive. Similar scenes unfolded across Europe in other years of scarcity. Germans mixing sawdust into bread. Irish families eating little more than potatoes and buttermilk. Poles relying on turnips and wild herbs. Hunger was inventive, but it was not forgiving. Even in years without dramatic famine, diets in winter were brutally limited. Meat was rare among the poor, reserved for feast days or special occasions. Salted pork, herring, or dried fish might appear in coastal or riverine regions, but most families lived on bread, porridge, or gruel. Vegetables were preserved in cellars or pickled, but supplies dwindled quickly. Dairy was unreliable, as cows produced little milk in the cold months. Hunger in winter meant not sudden starvation, but steady decline, bodies weakened by inadequate nutrition, children stunted, and adults increasingly susceptible to disease. The impact of hunger on children was especially severe. Malnutrition contributed to high infant mortality, already worsened by cold and disease. Surviving records from parish registers in England and France show seasonal spikes in child burials during late winter and early spring, precisely when food was scarcest. For the poor, the cycle was relentless. Hunger bred illness, illness bred death, and each winter tested the limits of family survival. Markets became places of tension and despair. Bread riots erupted when prices rose beyond endurance. In 18th century France, such uprisings were common, fueled by the desperation of those who could no longer afford to eat. In England, similar unrest broke out when grain was exported while locals starved. The poor understood their suffering not only as natural misfortune but as social injustice, the product of unequal distribution and neglect by rulers. Winter hunger therefore carried political weight, shaping relationships between classes and states. Relief efforts varied. In some regions, parishes distributed bread to the needy, funded by church, tithes, or local charity. In cities, charitable institutions like soup kitchens fed the destitute. Yet these efforts were inadequate against widespread scarcity. In France, officials sometimes attempted to regulate bread prices, but enforcement was uneven and corruption common. In Prussia, state granaries were established to stabilize supplies, but access remained limited for the poorest. Hunger exposed the limits of early modern welfare systems, which depended on local goodwill rather than state obligation. The endless hunger of the poor was not only a physical experience, but a cultural reality. Folk songs and tales from the 18th century often speak of empty cupboards, thin soups, and prayers for bread. Proverbs reinforced the association of hunger with virtue and endurance. Hunger is the best sauce was repeated across Europe, a grim acknowledgement of necessity. In sermons, priests linked famine to divine punishment, urging patience and piety. For the poor, however, hunger was not abstract. It was daily pain, and no sermon filled an empty stomach. Survival strategies reflected desperation. Families stretched flour with fillers such as chestnut meal, pea flour, or even powdered bones. Soups were diluted endlessly to feed more mouths. Foraging for wild herbs, roots, and nuts became routine. In some regions, famine foods like bark bread or acorn mush entered cultural memory as symbols of suffering. These substitutes kept people alive, but they weakened bodies further, lacking the nutrition needed to endure the cold. Hunger also shaped migration. Families abandoned villages when local supplies failed, seeking work or food in towns. Records from German principalities note waves of beggar migrants moving along roads in winter, knocking on monastery gates or city walls for charity. In Ireland, seasonal migration increased as rural poor sought employment in towns during lean months. Hunger displaced populations, eroding community stability and spreading both suffering and disease across wider regions. The cycle of hunger, famine, and disease was self-reinforcing. Malnourished bodies succumbed quickly to typhus or influenza. Epidemics were therefore not separate crises, but part of the same system of deprivation. In medical records from Vienna and Paris, physicians noted the link between poor nutrition and mortality during cold winters. Though germ theory lay in the future, the connection between hunger and death was plain to see. By the end of the 18th century, hunger remained the defining feature of poverty. Agricultural improvements, such as new crops like the potato, offered some relief, but acceptance was uneven. In parts of Ireland, potatoes became a vital staple, but reliance on a single crop also created vulnerability, as the later 19th century famine would reveal. For much of Europe, hunger remained cyclical, recurring each winter as predictably as frost. The endless hunger of the 1700s was thus not an occasional disaster but a permanent condition. Winters made it visible, stripping away illusions of security and exposing the fragility of survival. For the poor, hunger was not merely about food. It was about inequality, vulnerability, and the precarious balance of life in a world where one failed harvest could mean death. In the Europe of the 18th century, winter was a universal fact, but how it was endured depended entirely on wealth. The cold did not distinguish between noble and peasant, merchant and laborer, but the resources to resist it were distributed unequally. For the rich, winter could be an inconvenience softened by luxury. For the poor, it was a recurring crisis that threatened survival. To trace the lines of inequality in the 1700s, one need only step inside the homes of rich and poor and see how each confronted the same cold in utterly different ways. The wealthy enjoyed houses built to withstand the season. In palaces and grand estates, thick stone walls were lined with wood paneling, and floors were covered with tapestries and carpets. Fireplaces were not a single hearth, but multiple sources of heat, often in every chamber. Servants maintained fires throughout the day and night, ensuring that aristocrats rarely felt the bitter cold that gripped their estates. Beds were luxurious, with feather mattresses, linen sheets, and fur blankets. In France, nobles at Versailles could retire in relative warmth, even as peasants nearby shivered in cottages with failing roofs. Fuel was abundant for the elite. Nobles and wealthy merchants could afford steady supplies of wood or coal, transported at great cost if necessary. In England, the rising coal industry meant wealthy households in London burned sea coal in large quantities, while in Paris, aristocrats stocked cordwood delivered from surrounding forests. Some estates even had their own managed woodlands, ensuring a sustainable supply of fuel that was off-limits to commoners. Fire was a privilege, and warmth itself became a marker of class. In contrast, the poor rationed every log and every ember. Firewood prices rose steeply in winter, often consuming a disproportionate share of a laborer's wages. Peasants in France, Germany, and Austria sometimes spent half their income just to buy wood for cooking and heating. In desperate times, families scavenged for twigs, animal dung, or even burned furniture and thatch from roofs. The hearth, which for the rich was a centerpiece of comfort, for the poor became a desperate measure, with fires allowed to die at night because fuel could not be spared. The physical experience of cold underscored inequality. In aristocratic homes, clothing was layered silk, wool, and fur. The wealthy wore lined cloaks, gloves, and boots indoors as fashion as much as necessity. By contrast, the poor dressed in patched garments, often handed down through generations. Many lacked proper shoes, walking barefoot on icy ground or wrapping feet in rags. While nobles displayed wealth in winter fashions, peasants revealed poverty in tattered cloaks and threadbare caps. The symbolic divide was even greater. Winter for the rich was often a season of festivity. At Versailles, banquets, masked balls, and hunts continued despite the cold. In England, winter was marked by social gatherings, concerts, and theatrical performances. The wealthy could turn cold into spectacle, hosting frost fairs on frozen rivers or commissioning paintings of winter landscapes. For the poor, winter meant hunger, silence, and survival. The same season was celebrated above and dreaded below, reinforcing the gulf between classes. Accounts from contemporaries highlight the starkness of this contrast. In 1709, during the Great Frost, Parisian diarist Matthew Murray recorded nobles attending the opera while peasants froze in the streets. In London, reports described families huddled in alleys without shelter, even as frost fairs offered entertainments for those who could afford them. The juxtaposition of festivity and despair was not lost on observers, many of whom saw it as evidence of society's imbalance. Heating technology itself became a marker of wealth. The poor relied on open hearths, which lost most of their heat through chimneys. The rich experimented with stoves, braziers, and more efficient fireplace designs. In the German states, tiled stoves, Kechelofen, became popular among the wealthy, radiating heat long after the fire had died. These innovations required investment in infrastructure the poor could never afford. Thus, technology that mitigated winter's severity became yet another barrier between rich and poor. Urban settings made the divide even sharper. In London, Paris, and Vienna, wealthy families inhabited well-constructed houses with glazed windows, servants to insulate rooms, and stores of fuel delivered to their doors. The poor lived in damp tenements where drafts swept through broken panes patched with paper. Wealthy merchants dined on roasted meats and imported wines in warm halls, while laborers in the same city ate cold bread in freezing rooms. Poverty and wealth coexisted in close proximity, but their experience of winter might as well have been two different worlds. Inequality was also enforced by law. In many regions, peasants were forbidden from cutting wood in forests reserved for aristocrats. Poachers who gathered fuel risked fines, imprisonment, or even corporal punishment. While elites claimed rights to hunt game and fell timber, the poor endured shortages. Forest laws, designed to protect noble privilege, left commoners vulnerable in precisely the season when resources were most needed. Warmth, in this sense, was not just an economic divide but a legal boundary. Charity softened but did not erase the gap. Churches distributed firewood to the needy, and some nobles made gestures of relief by providing food or fuel to peasants on their estates. In England, parish overseers sometimes arranged for coal deliveries to the poorest households. Yet these acts of charity were inconsistent, often symbolic, and never enough to close the vast gulf. The poor depended on sporadic relief, while the wealthy insulated themselves from the cold with surpluses. The cultural memory of this inequality survives in descriptions of winters past. Folk songs and tales often contrasted the warm halls of the wealthy with the frozen cottages of the poor. Satirical pamphlets mocked the indifference of elites, portraying them as feasting while peasants starved. The disparity between heat for the wealthy and cold for the poor became not just a physical condition, but a moral and political symbol, fueling resentment that would later shape revolutionary discourse. The lesson of 18th century winters is stark. Survival depended not only on climate, but on class. The same snow that glittered on aristocratic estates buried peasants in hunger and cold. Wealth could purchase insulation, fuel, and food. Poverty meant exposure, scarcity, and risk. Winter was universal, but warmth was not. The inequality of survival defined the season, leaving the poor to endure while the rich remained sheltered in comfort. In the 18th century, the harshest measure of winter's cruelty was written on the bodies of children. Poverty, hunger, and cold converged most devastatingly on the youngest members of society. Infants and children bore the brunt of malnutrition, disease, and exposure, and their survival determined the fate of families and communities. To understand the impact of winter poverty in the 1700s, one must look closely at the lives and deaths of these famine's children. Infant mortality was staggering by modern standards. Across Europe, between 1/4 and 1/3 of all children died before the age of 5. In some regions, particularly during years of famine or epidemic, the figure rose even higher. Parish registers from rural France and England reveal spikes in burials during late winter and early spring, when food was scarce and cold at its worst. In Saxony, during the winter famine of 1772-1771, nearly half of all children born that year did not survive to their first birthday. These statistics were not anomalies. They reflected the fragile balance of life in a world where poverty magnified every risk. Malnutrition was central to this crisis. For poor families, winter diets lacked the calories and nutrients required for growing children. Bread and thin gruel formed the bulk of daily meals, with little milk, meat, or vegetables to supplement. Infants weaned too early were fed pap made of bread soaked in water or broth, which offered little nutrition and carried risks of contamination. In households where mothers were malnourished, breast milk was insufficient, forcing reliance on inadequate substitutes. The result was widespread stunting, weakened immunity, and high susceptibility to disease. Diseases exploited this vulnerability. Measles, smallpox, whooping cough, and dysentery were constant threats, and malnourished children succumbed quickly. Winter dampness worsened respiratory illnesses such as pneumonia and tuberculosis. Typhus and influenza swept through crowded cottages and tenements, claiming young lives in devastating numbers. Records from Paris hospitals in the 1760s note that most child admissions in winter were linked to malnutrition and infection, conditions that reinforced one another. Hunger weakened bodies, disease exploited weakness, and mortality followed. The cold itself was lethal. Infants lacked the ability to regulate body temperature, and in drafty cottages, exposure was unavoidable. Families attempted to protect babies by swaddling them tightly, layering cloth and rags around their fragile bodies. Yet in rooms where fires died at night, temperatures dropped below freezing. Accounts from rural England describe infants found lifeless in their mother's arms after cold nights, victims not of neglect but of the season's merciless grip. For older children, frostbite and chilblains were common, leaving permanent damage even in survival. The social consequences of child mortality were profound. Families accustomed themselves to loss in ways that appear shocking today. Baptism was often performed within hours of birth, not only for religious reasons, but because survival was so uncertain. Parents sometimes delayed naming children until they passed infancy. Parish priests recorded burials of unnamed infants in high numbers, a stark reminder of how fragile new life was. Grief was real, but death was expected, woven into the rhythm of poor families' lives. Winter hunger also shaped family structures. High infant mortality influenced reproductive patterns. Families had many children, knowing some would not survive. Poor households relied on children's labor from an early age, so survival of at least a few offspring was essential. In rural France and Italy, children herded animals, gathered fuel, or worked as apprentices by the age of 6 or 7. In cities, children sold goods on streets or labored in workshops. Poverty demanded contribution, and survival dictated the pace of childhood. Abandonment was another grim reality. In urban centers, particularly Paris, London, and Vienna, foundling hospitals filled with infants whose families could not feed them. The Hôtel des Enfants, Trouves in Paris, received thousands of abandoned children each year by the mid-18th century. Mortality rates in such institutions were catastrophic, often exceeding 70%. Parents did not abandon lightly, but the desperation of winter hunger left them with no alternative. These lost children of famine became a hidden casualty of poverty. Charitable efforts to save children were widespread but insufficient. Churches organized food distributions, and some hospitals experimented with improved care. In England, the Foundling Hospital in London, established in 1739, aimed to provide shelter and education for abandoned infants. Philanthropists like Thomas Coram and Jonas Hanway campaigned for reforms to improve survival rates. Yet resources were limited, and prejudice against the poor often undermined assistance. Many elites saw high child mortality not as a tragedy to prevent, but as an inevitable result of poverty. Cultural attitudes reflected this harshness. In literature and sermons, famine's children were sometimes portrayed as symbols of innocence and suffering, reminders of society's moral obligations. At other times they were depicted as burdens on parishes, evidence of poor families' supposed irresponsibility. This tension shaped debates about charity, welfare, and responsibility. Should the poor be helped to raise their children, or was suffering part of divine order? These questions haunted 18th century societies, especially in years of widespread famine. The emotional toll on families, though harder to measure, was immense. Diaries and letters from poor mothers, though rare, speak of grief and resignation. In one French village during the harsh winter of 1709, a parish priest noted that women bury their children with dry eyes, for hunger has stolen their tears. Such records reveal both the depth of suffering and the normalization of loss. Children were loved, but poverty conditioned families to expect their absence at the same time. Survival of children was a cause for celebration. Festivals marking a child's first birthday or successful weaning carried immense significance in poor communities. Godparents played vital roles, offering gifts of food, clothing, or fuel to help sustain children through their most vulnerable years. Community networks of kin and neighbors provided occasional relief, though they could not replace the structural inequalities that caused so much death. By the end of the 18th century, change was beginning. The introduction of the potato in parts of Europe improved child nutrition. providing a more reliable and calorie-dense food source. Advances in medicine, such as smallpox inoculation, offered hope against deadly diseases. Yet progress was uneven, and for most poor families, winters remained a season of peril. Children continued to die in vast numbers, leaving famine's mark not only on individual lives but on the demographic history of Europe. The story of famine's children is not just about mortality rates. It is about how poverty shaped childhood itself. For the poor, childhood was shorter, harsher, and more uncertain. Winter magnified every risk, turning hunger into death and cold into catastrophe. The resilience of families in the face of such odds is remarkable, but so too is the injustice of their suffering. These children were not simply victims of weather. They were casualties of a society that left the poor to endure the cold without protection. In the 18th century, warmth was never free. For the poor, survival in winter hinged on access to one of the scarcest and most contested resources of the age: fuel. To keep a fire alive through the long, freezing months demanded wood, peat, or coal, materials that required money, labor, or privilege to obtain. The price of warmth was not merely economic. It was social, political, and even legal, reflecting inequalities that made winter harsher for the poor than for the wealthy. Wood remained the dominant fuel in much of Europe. Forests stretched across France, Germany, Poland, and Scandinavia, but access was far from equal. Noble landowners and monarchs claimed large tracts as private reserves, guarded by law and by force. In France, royal edicts limited peasant rights to gather fallen branches or dead wood. Cutting green wood was forbidden and punished with heavy fines or imprisonment. In Germany and Austria, similar restrictions protected forests for elite hunting or commercial sale. What had once been a communal resource became increasingly privatized, transforming forests from lifelines into battlegrounds. The result was widespread conflict. Poor families, desperate for fuel, resorted to illegal wood gathering, often under the cover of night. Wood theft became one of the most prosecuted crimes in 18th century Europe. Records from French courts show peasants fined or jailed for taking branches from royal forests, while in Prussia, poachers risked corporal punishment. Local officials enforced these laws with severity, as forests represented both revenue and status for rulers. For the poor, however, the choice was stark: break the law or freeze. Peat provided an alternative in certain regions. In the Netherlands, Ireland, and parts of northern Germany, bogs were dug for peat bricks, dried and burned as fuel. For poor families, peat was vital, cheaper than wood and relatively abundant. Yet even peatlands were subject to regulation. In Ireland, landlords controlled bog rights, charging tenants fees or restricting access. In the Netherlands, commercial peat extraction turned bogs into commodities, leaving poor households competing with merchants for supplies. The environmental impact was profound. Centuries of peat cutting reshaped landscapes, draining wetlands and altering ecosystems. For the poor, however, these ecological transformations mattered less than the immediate question of how to keep a fire alive. Coal, meanwhile, emerged as a powerful new fuel, especially in Britain. By the early 18th century, coal was already central to London's energy supply. The Thames became a highway for shipments from Newcastle, feeding the city's insatiable demand. Wealthy households and industries consumed the bulk, but poorer families also relied on small quantities purchased by the sack. Yet coal was not universally accessible. In rural England and in much of continental Europe, transport costs made coal prohibitively expensive. Moreover, coal required grates and chimneys suited to its smoky burn, infrastructure the poor could rarely afford. For many peasants, coal was not an option, leaving them dependent on dwindling wood supplies. The price of fuel was a crushing burden. In France, during the winter of 1709, wood prices tripled, consuming more than half of a labourer's wages. In England, poor families sometimes spent a third of their income on coal, leaving little for food. Seasonal inflation was predictable. As winter deepened, prices rose, hitting hardest those least able to pay. Parish relief funds occasionally provided fuel allowances, but assistance was inconsistent. Survival depended on whether a family could stretch meager supplies without exhausting them. Fuel scarcity shaped daily life in poor households. Fires were kept small, often just enough to cook meals. Families huddled close to the hearth, leaving the rest of the house unheated. At night, fires were extinguished to conserve fuel, plunging homes into freezing darkness. Children went to bed early, wrapped in rags or straw, while adults endured long, cold evenings. The smell of smoke permeated clothing and walls, a constant reminder of how precious each ember was. For the poor, warmth was not comfort but a carefully rationed necessity. Communal strategies offered some relief. In villages, neighbors sometimes shared fires, gathering in a single cottage to conserve fuel. In towns, public bakehouses doubled as sources of warmth, with poor families lingering near ovens after their bread was baked. In extreme winters, city dwellers crowded into churches or taverns, seeking respite from freezing rooms. These shared spaces reflected both solidarity and desperation. As communities improvised ways to survive the season's demands, the inequities of fuel access were not lost on contemporaries. Writers and reformers in France and England criticized forest laws that criminalized the poor while protecting elite privilege. Enlightenment thinkers linked the struggle for fuel to broader debates about justice and property. In the 1760s, the French economist Francois Quesnel argued that forest restrictions harmed national productivity by leaving peasants unable to work in winter. Yet reforms were slow, and enforcement remained harsh. The crime of gathering fuel symbolized the broader inequality of the age. Fuel also played a role in politics and unrest. Bread riots are better remembered, but fuel riots erupted as well, particularly in cities. In 1739, London saw protests over coal shortages, while in Paris, wood markets were flashpoints for violence. The anger of the poor was directed not only at scarcity, but at the perception of injustice. That resources existed, but were withheld or priced beyond reach. These confrontations underscored how the price of warmth was inseparable from questions of power. Environmental change compounded the crisis. Deforestation accelerated in the 18th century. As expanding populations, industries, and militaries consumed vast amounts of timber, shipbuilding alone devoured forests in Britain and France, leaving less wood for common use. The Little Ice Age intensified demand just as supplies dwindled. By the late 1700s, some regions faced severe shortages, forcing even wealthier households to adapt. For the poor, deforestation meant longer journeys to collect wood, higher prices, and greater risk of punishment for trespassing. Amid this struggle, ingenuity flourished. Poor families made use of every available resource. Dried dung, crop residues, and even rubbish were burned for heat. In Scotland, seaweed was dried and used as fuel. In parts of Central Europe, families gathered pine cones and brushwood for kindling. These improvisations could not match the efficiency of wood or coal, but they represented the relentless determination to survive. Every scrap that could burn was pressed into service against the cold by the close of the 18th century. Energy transitions were underway. Coal's dominance grew in Britain and began to spread elsewhere, paving the way for the Industrial Revolution. For the poor, however, these changes offered little immediate relief. Wood scarcity, high prices, and restrictive laws continued to define their winters. The price of warmth remained steep, measured not only in coins but in labor, risk, and sometimes imprisonment. To speak of warmth in the 1700s is to speak of inequality. The fires of the rich burned brightly, fueled by privilege and abundance. The poor, by contrast, shivered around fading embers, their survival dependent on laws that criminalized their need. Winter exposed this divide with brutal clarity. Heat was not simply a natural resource. It was a marker of class, privilege, and power in a Europe where poverty left millions cold. Winter in the 18th century was not only a season of cold and hunger, it was also a season of sickness. Poverty, malnutrition, and overcrowding created the perfect environment for epidemics that swept through villages and cities alike. For the poor, who already lived at the edge of survival, disease was the shadow that followed hunger and cold, turning hardship into catastrophe. To trace the story of winter in the 1700s is to trace the rise and fall of epidemics that claimed countless lives among Europe's poorest classes. Respiratory diseases were the most immediate killers. In cottages where smoke filled the air from poorly vented hearths, and in tenements where damp walls never dried, the lungs bore the cost of winter living. Pneumonia, bronchitis, and tuberculosis thrived. Tuberculosis, often called consumption, was endemic throughout the 18th century, disproportionately affecting the poor who lived in cramped, unventilated dwellings. In parish records from England, spikes in deaths from fevers of the chest appear each winter, reflecting the toll of cold combined with smoke and malnutrition. Typhus was another relentless scourge, spread by lice in dirty clothing and bedding. It struck hardest in winter when washing was rare and bodies huddled together for warmth. Known as jail fever because of its prevalence in prisons, typhus was just as common in poor cottages. Epidemics swept through Europe's cities in the 1700s, often killing thousands at a time. In 1741, an epidemic in Ireland, worsened by famine, claimed tens of thousands of lives. Victims endured fever, rashes, and delirium, often dying within weeks. For the poor, already weakened by hunger, typhus was almost always fatal. Smallpox haunted the century as well. Unlike other diseases, it struck across classes, but its impact was most devastating among the poor. Epidemics flared in cycles every decade or so, with winter often intensifying outbreaks as families crowded into confined spaces. In London, records show thousands of child deaths during smallpox waves, many occurring in the coldest months. In rural communities, smallpox could wipe out entire cohorts of children, leaving villages depopulated. By the 1760s, inoculation began to spread among wealthier families, but the poor often lacked access, leaving them defenseless until the development of Jenner's vaccine at the century's close. Influenza, though less deadly, was a recurring threat. Outbreaks in 1729 to 1730, 1732 to 1733, and later in the century spread rapidly across Europe, killing the elderly and the malnourished. Physicians noted how hunger amplified the severity of the disease. In Vienna, reports during the 1732 outbreak observed that those weakened by want of bread were among the first to die. Influenza, like many winter illnesses, did not need to be catastrophic on its own. It became deadly when layered upon poverty. Urban environments magnified these risks. In Paris, London, and Naples, tenements housed families in close quarters, where disease spread with devastating speed. Without sewage systems or clean water, dysentery and other gastrointestinal diseases were constant threats, killing children in shocking numbers. Winter only worsened conditions. With rivers frozen, water supplies became stagnant, and waste accumulated in frozen streets. In these environments, epidemics were less an exception than a seasonal expectation. Rural areas were not spared. Disease traveled along trade routes, carried by soldiers, merchants, and beggars. In times of famine, migration spread infections further, as desperate families sought food in towns. Parish priests in rural Germany and Poland recorded entire villages struck by fever during hard winters, with burials so frequent that churchyards overflowed. Isolation offered little protection when hunger and cold had already weakened. Entire communities' medical understanding was limited, leaving the poor without effective remedies. Physicians debated theories of miasmas, foul airs thought to cause illness, and prescribed purges, bleedings, or herbal infusions. For the wealthy, such treatments offered at least the comfort of attention. For the poor, medical care was inaccessible, and healing fell to home remedies, garlic poultices, vinegar washes, or charms against fever. Some relief came from charity hospitals, but mortality rates inside these institutions were often higher than outside, as infections spread unchecked in overcrowded wards. Disease carried not only physical but social consequences. Epidemics strained already fragile economies, as laborers fell ill and families lost breadwinners. In famine years, death from disease compounded hunger, leaving communities too weakened to recover quickly. Fear of contagion deepened social divisions. In cities, the wealthy sometimes fled during epidemics, retreating to country estates, leaving the poor to endure the full brunt of outbreaks. The shadow of disease was thus another marker of inequality, its impact sharpened by privilege and poverty. Religious interpretations framed epidemics as divine punishment. Priests and ministers urged repentance, processions, and fasting during outbreaks, emphasizing sin as the root of suffering. For the poor, these messages provided meaning but not relief. Faith offered hope, but hunger and cold made bodies no less vulnerable. Over time, skepticism grew, particularly among Enlightenment thinkers who sought natural explanations. Yet for ordinary people, winter diseases reinforced the sense that survival lay beyond human control, subject to forces of both nature and providence. Despite the devastation, resilience persisted. Communities supported one another during epidemics, sharing food with sick neighbors, caring for orphaned children, and burying the dead with dignity. Folklore and rituals emerged to ward off disease. Charms, protective prayers, and seasonal traditions meant to safeguard households. While these offered little medical protection, they gave emotional strength in a world where illness was unavoidable. By the end of the 18th century, small signs of progress emerged. Inoculation against smallpox spread more widely, reducing child mortality in some regions. Public health measures, such as quarantine and improved burial practices, were introduced in major cities. Yet for the poor, these advances came slowly, often too late. Winter remained a season of dread, when the shadow of disease fell heaviest on those least able to resist. The story of disease in the 1700s is inseparable from the story of poverty. Hunger, cold, and crowding were not just conditions of hardship. They were conditions of contagion. Each winter, the cycle repeated: weakened bodies, rampant infections, premature death. The shadow of disease was not a distant threat, but an ever-present companion, ensuring that even survival of hunger did not guarantee life. When winter stripped the poor of food, fuel, and health, survival often came down to one last recourse: the appeal for charity. Begging was not an exception in 18th century Europe. It was a visible and pervasive part of society, woven into the rhythms of daily life and especially acute in the long months of cold. The season drove those without resources, widows, orphans, laborers without work, and the sick onto the streets, into churchyards, and before the doors of the wealthy. To walk through a European town or city in January or February was to see the stark presence of poverty in its most public form. The scale of begging was immense. Contemporary observers in Paris estimated that during hard winters, tens of thousands of beggars crowded the streets. In London, travelers remarked on the constant pleas from the poor at every corner, intensified during food shortages or fuel crises. Rural areas were no less affected. Parish priests wrote of armies of the destitute moving from village to village, hoping to find food or firewood. Migration swelled during the cold season, as families unable to sustain themselves at home joined the ranks of itinerant beggars. Begging carried stigma, but it was also tolerated as a recognized aspect of the social order. Christianity placed almsgiving at the heart of moral duty. Churches and monasteries distributed bread, soup, or firewood, and collections were taken during services to support the poor. In Catholic countries, confraternities and brotherhoods organized charity on feast days, handing out loaves of bread or small coins. In Protestant regions, parish overseers administered relief funds, though often with strict oversight and moral judgment. Charity was expected, but it was also controlled, reflecting anxieties about encouraging idleness. The poor themselves navigated this system with resilience and strategy. Some begged outside churches, appealing to religious sentiment as worshippers exited services. Others sought alms at markets, taverns, or roadsides where travelers might be more generous. Women and children were especially prominent among beggars, their presence considered more sympathetic. Widows with infants in their arms became emblematic figures of poverty in winter, their plight immortalized in sermons, pamphlets, and artwork. Yet begging was never free of suspicion. Authorities feared that the visible poor might harbor criminals, spread disease, or incite unrest. In many cities, beggars were rounded up during winter months and confined to workhouses or hospitals. Paris saw repeated campaigns to clear streets of beggars, particularly in years of famine. London's vagrancy laws criminalized begging without parish permits, forcing the poor into a cycle of arrests and release. These measures reflected the tension at the heart of 18th century charity, a recognition of need, but also a fear of disorder. Workhouses embodied this ambivalence. Established in England and later imitated elsewhere, they offered shelter and food in exchange for labor. Conditions were deliberately harsh, designed to discourage reliance on charity. Inmates performed tasks such as spinning, weaving, or breaking stones, often in cold and unsanitary conditions. For some poor families, workhouses were the only alternative to starvation. For others, they were places of last resort, feared for their cruelty and the loss of freedom they imposed. Despite official suspicion, private charity remained widespread. Wealthy nobles and merchants made seasonal donations of food or firewood, gestures that reinforced social hierarchies as much as they provided relief. These acts were often public, designed to display generosity and piety. In rural areas, landlords sometimes distributed grain or fuel to tenants, though not always without expectation of loyalty or service in return. Charity in the 18th century was rarely anonymous. It was a visible transaction, binding poor and rich in a relationship of dependence. The church stood at the center of this network. Sermons in winter emphasized the Christian duty of charity, reminding the wealthy that neglecting the poor endangered their own souls. Festivals like Christmas or St. Martin's Day often included almsgiving traditions, offering brief respite to the needy. Parish records show systematic distributions of bread and coal during particularly severe winters. Yet these gestures, though life-saving for some, rarely addressed the structural conditions of poverty. Relief was temporary, designed to sustain through a season, not to alter long-term survival. The moral framing of charity was significant. The deserving poor, widows, orphans, the elderly, and the infirm were considered worthy of assistance. The able-bodied poor, especially men, were often treated with suspicion, expected to find work even when none existed. Winter made this distinction cruelly visible. Agricultural laborers had no employment during frozen months, yet their need for relief was interpreted as laziness. The language of deservingness shaped who received aid, and who was left to beg in the streets. Children were among the most frequent recipients of charity. Images of starving orphans moved donors in ways that adult suffering sometimes did not. Foundling hospitals, orphanages, and parish schools often relied on donations collected during winter months. Yet survival rates remained low. In Paris's Anfangstrauß, mortality among abandoned children hovered around 70%, despite charitable intentions. Charity kept many alive, but could not overcome the deeper forces of hunger, disease, and inadequate shelter. For the poor, charity was both lifeline and humiliation. Begging required public exposure of need, a surrender of dignity in exchange for survival. Contemporary accounts describe beggars kneeling in snow before churches or knocking at doors in the freezing dark. Some communities pitied them. Others turned them away with scorn. Survival depended on how generosity and suspicion played out in each encounter. Winter amplified the desperation, as the line between hunger and death narrowed with each passing week. Reformers of the late 18th century began to question these dynamics. Enlightenment thinkers like the Marquis de Condorcet and Adam Smith criticized systems that left the poor dependent on sporadic charity rather than structural solutions. In France, debates about subsistence rights foreshadowed revolutionary calls for bread and justice. In England, growing concern about vagrancy and child poverty led to new experiments in parish relief. Yet, for most of the century, winter remained a season when the poor had little choice but to beg, and when charity, uneven and fragile, determined survival. Begging and charity were thus not marginal features of 18th century life. They were central to how societies managed poverty in the coldest months. They revealed both the resilience of the poor and the limits of relief, both the generosity of individuals and the indifference of systems. In winter, the poor's survival often hinged on the coins dropped in a hand. the loaf given at a church door, or the bundle of firewood offered by a landlord. For the poor, each act of charity was more than kindness. It was, quite literally, the difference between life and death. If winter was hard for families, it was brutal for those without them. Across 18th century Europe, thousands of children lived and died on the streets, surviving on scraps, petty theft, and the uncertain mercy of passers-by. These were not fictional figures drawn from moral tales. They were the visible consequence of poverty, famine, and abandonment. The streets of London, Paris, Naples, and countless towns echoed with their presence in winter, when hunger deepened and cold stripped them of even the barest protections. The roots of street childhood lay in structural poverty. Many children were orphaned by disease. Smallpox, typhus, and tuberculosis claimed parents with frightening regularity. Others were abandoned at birth, their parents too poor to feed another mouth. Foundling hospitals absorbed some, but survival rates were grim. In Paris's Hapital Day and Fangstrauves, more than 2/3 of infants died. Those who lived often escaped or were expelled, swelling the ranks of street children who formed a distinct and desperate population by the time they reached adolescence. Urban centers were the most visible arenas of this phenomenon. London, with its fast-growing population, was notorious for its swarms of beggar children. Contemporary pamphlets describe gangs of ragged boys and girls haunting marketplaces, docks, and alleys. They begged, picked pockets, and scavenged refuse to survive. In Paris, the police archives of the 1720s list hundreds of arrests of enfants vagabonds, children as young as 6 detained for begging without permits. Naples, with its sprawling poor quarters, saw similar numbers. Observers spoke of children sleeping under arcades, in stables, or on church steps. Especially during harsh winters, rural areas had their own street children, though less visible. Orphans and abandoned youths drifted from village to village, offering labor in exchange for food. In Germany and Poland, parish registers sometimes record children without known parents buried after collapsing in winter fields. These were famine's children, forced into itinerancy when households could no longer absorb them. Villages sometimes took in orphans, but more often, communities would too burden themselves to provide more than minimal charity. Work was both a survival tool and a trap. Street children performed countless menial tasks, carrying water, sweeping inns, selling matches or rushlights, and fetching fuel. In London, boys were employed as climbing sweeps, sent into narrow chimneys to clean soot at terrible risk of suffocation and burns. In Paris, girls hawked apples or kindling, often harassed by authorities for trading without licenses. Wages were meager, food insecure, and exploitation constant. Winter made such work harder. Icy streets slowed trade, and fewer customers meant fewer coins in a child's hand. Theft became the alternative when work failed. Court records from the Old Bailey in London list numerous cases of children stealing bread, coal, or clothing during winter months. Many were sentenced harshly: whipping, imprisonment, or transportation to colonies. Authorities viewed street children less as victims of poverty and more as threats to order. In Paris, police reports describe campaigns to round up little vagabonds and confine them in correctional institutions. These measures reflected the fear that hunger-driven children might disrupt the fragile balance of urban life. Religion and charity offered limited refuge. Churches distributed bread, soup, and clothing to children during feast days. and confraternities sometimes supported orphaned youth. In Catholic countries, missions sought to teach trades to abandoned boys, while girls were directed toward domestic service or convents. In Protestant regions, parish schools absorbed some children, offering literacy alongside discipline. Yet numbers overwhelmed capacity, and survival for many remained precarious. For every child saved by charity, many more remained outside, sleeping in doorways as frost gathered on their rags. The cultural image of street children hardened into stereotype. In literature and pamphlets, they appeared alternately as symbols of innocence, betrayed, or as dangerous delinquents. Reformers like Jonas Hanway in England campaigned to improve their conditions, pointing to the moral responsibility of society to protect the young. But others condemned them as lazy, corrupt, or inherently criminal. This moral ambivalence shaped policies that oscillated between charity and punishment, leaving children caught between pity and repression. Winter magnified every risk. Thinly clothed, poorly fed, and often barefoot, street children suffered frostbite, respiratory illness, and starvation at higher rates than any other group. Mortality soared in severe winters like 1709 or 1740, when food vanished from markets and fires went cold in poor quarters. Contemporary accounts describe children frozen in alleys or found lifeless under bridges. Such scenes shocked observers but were not exceptional. They were the brutal normality of 18th century winters for those without. Families' survival strategies reveal resilience amid despair. Street children formed loose groups for protection, sharing scraps and sheltering together in stables, ruins, or market halls. Older children sometimes cared for younger ones, creating fragile communities of necessity. In Naples, travelers noted gangs of boys who pooled earnings to buy bread, distributing it among themselves at night. In London, chimney sweeps' apprentices slept huddled in soot bags, using warmth from one another to endure the cold. These improvised networks offered solidarity, but they could not erase the hunger or the risks of disease. Some found escape through conscription into armies or navies. Recruiters targeted orphaned or abandoned boys, offering food and clothing in exchange for service. Naval impressment in Britain often swept up street children, turning beggars into cabin boys or powder carriers. In continental Europe, military orphan schools trained boys for regiments. While these paths provided survival, they also exposed children to new dangers as wars consumed countless young lives. For girls, domestic service was often the only escape, though it brought its own risks of exploitation and abuse. By the late 18th century, reformist energy began to gather. Philanthropists, Enlightenment thinkers, and early social critics argued that neglecting street children endangered both morality and stability. The London Foundling Hospital, founded in 1739, became a model for institutional care, though survival rates remained poor. In Paris, police reforms sought to regulate child labor and reduce abandonment with limited success. Street children remained a stubborn reality, reflecting deeper structural inequalities that charity and policing alike could not resolve. The plight of children of the streets reveals the sharpest edge of poverty in the 18th century. Adults might scrape by through labor or parish relief, but children had few defenses. Winter stripped away any illusions of resilience, exposing the brutal cost of hunger, cold, and neglect. These were not isolated tragedies, but systemic realities, repeated year after year in every city and town across Europe. Their presence, in turn, shaped the conscience of societies on the cusp of change. Enlightenment debates about education, charity, and the rights of man were informed in part by the visible suffering of children in the streets. The haunting image of ragged boys and girls begging in snow-covered marketplaces served as a reminder of the human cost of inequality. For the poor themselves, these children were not symbols but family members, neighbors, and lost kin. Winter in the 18th century did not create poverty, but it revealed it most starkly. And nowhere was this revelation clearer than in the lives of children of the streets, famine's youngest victims, whose survival depended on scraps, chance, and fleeting acts of charity. For the poor of the 18th century, winter survival depended on one thing above all: shelter. Without walls to block the wind or a roof to fend off snow and rain, hunger and cold were swift executioners. Yet for millions of Europe's poorest, shelter was precarious, improvised, and often barely distinguishable from exposure. The struggle for housing in the 1700s reveals not only the material hardships of poverty but also the structural inequalities that left entire classes vulnerable to the season's worst. Cruelty in rural Europe. Cottages formed the backbone of peasant shelter. These dwellings were small, 1 or 2 rooms at most, built of local materials: wattle and daub in England, stone in Scotland, timber and clay in Central Europe. Roofs of thatch or wooden shingles offered little insulation and leaked in heavy snow. Floors were often compacted earth, damp in summer and frozen hard in winter. Smoke-blackened rafters hung low, absorbing the soot of countless fires. For poor families, these cottages were not havens of warmth, but fragile bulwarks against relentless cold. Overcrowding magnified the discomfort. Families often shared single-room cottages with livestock, whose presence was not just economic but practical. Cows, goats, or pigs generated body heat that warmed the space. Chickens roosted indoors, dogs and cats curled at the edges of straw beds. While this practice provided marginal warmth, it also brought filth, odor, and disease. Vermin flourished in these environments, and respiratory illness spread easily in smoke-filled, poorly ventilated rooms. Yet for the poor, there was no choice. To endure winter meant cramming together, human and animal alike. Under one leaking roof, urban housing posed different but equally severe challenges. As populations in cities like London, Paris, and Vienna swelled during the 18th century, tenements sprang up to accommodate the poor. These buildings, hastily constructed and poorly maintained, were crammed with families. Whole households lived in single rooms with broken windows patched by rags or paper. Water seeped through walls, and drafts cut through gaps in doors and roofs. In the worst cases, families sheltered in cellars, where dampness turned walls slimy and frost coated the floor. Contemporary reformers described these dwellings as pits of misery, unfit for human habitation even in the mildest seasons. For those without permanent homes, survival required improvisation. Abandoned barns, stables, and outbuildings provided temporary refuge. In cities, the homeless crowded into archways, market halls, or stairwells, huddling together for warmth. Some slept in carts or boats moored along rivers, wrapping themselves in rags or straw. In Naples, observers noted families living in the ruins of ancient buildings. In London, beggars bedded down under bridges or in church porches. Winter exposed these makeshift shelters most brutally, when icy winds or snowstorms transformed them into death traps. seasonal migration worsened the shelter crisis. During harvests, laborers moved for work, but in winter, when employment dried up, many were displaced. Towns saw an influx of destitute migrants, overwhelming existing housing. Foundling hospitals and almshouses turned away many for lack of space, leaving them to fend for themselves in streets and alleys. The homeless poor were especially visible in winters of famine or fuel shortage. Their bodies huddled in marketplaces or frozen in doorways, a stark reminder of society's failure to provide. Charitable institutions offered some relief, though often under punishing conditions. Workhouses in England, almshouses in Germany, and hospices in France admitted the poor, but overcrowding was severe. Conditions were deliberately austere, designed to discourage reliance on charity. Beds were hard, blankets thin, and food meager. Fires were rationed, leaving inmates scarcely warmer than they would have been outside. Mortality rates in such institutions soared during epidemics, as close quarters spread disease. For many, entering such shelter was a choice between humiliation and death in the open. The wealth divide was again starkly evident. The rich lived in stone mansions or townhouses with multiple heated rooms, thick draperies, and servants to maintain fires. Even their country hunting lodges were better insulated than the homes of peasants. The poor, by contrast, faced constant eviction threats when rent could not be paid. In cities, landlords had little incentive to improve conditions for tenants who lacked bargaining power. Legal protections were virtually non-existent. Shelter for the poor was never secure, always precarious, and easily lost to illness, debt, or disaster. Records from observers reveal the impact of these conditions. In the winter of 1740, during a European food shortage, letters from Irish clergymen described families lying in ruins of cabins, without fire, without bread, without covering. In France, parish priests reported peasants abandoning cottages that collapsed under snow, retreating to barns in desperation. In Germany, chroniclers noted families reduced to building huts of branches and straw in forest edges. Shelter in such times was not a home, but a fragile arrangement of scraps. The consequences for health were devastating. Dampness bred rheumatism, respiratory illnesses, and skin diseases. Smoke-filled cottages exacerbated lung infections, particularly in children. Frostbite left lasting injuries, while exhaustion from inadequate rest weakened bodies further. For infants, inadequate shelter meant near-certain death. For the elderly, poorly heated rooms accelerated decline. The cycle was relentless. Poor shelter created poor health, which in turn made it harder to labor, earn, and secure better housing. Yet even amid such conditions, ingenuity persisted. Families patched roofs with turf or clay, sealed windows with waxed cloth, and stuffed gaps in walls with moss or straw. Box beds, wooden enclosures resembling cupboards, were built in some regions to conserve warmth for sleeping. Communities sometimes pooled resources to repair cottages before winter, or to help homeless neighbors find temporary shelter. These efforts reflected resilience, though they could not erase the structural inequalities that left the poor so vulnerable in the first place. The symbolic weight of shelter also shaped culture and politics. The home, however modest, represented survival, dignity, and belonging. To lose it was to become truly destitute, exposed to the elements and the disdain of society. Winter made visible those without shelter, their presence in streets and alleys forcing the wealthy to confront poverty they otherwise ignored. In cities, The sight of huddled families outside churches or markets became a moral problem as well as a social one, fueling debates about responsibility, charity, and reform. By the late 18th century, these debates intensified. Enlightenment thinkers and reformers argued that poor housing was not only a private misfortune but a public danger, breeding disease, unrest, and immorality. Jonas Hanway in London campaigned for improved housing for the poor, linking shelter to social stability. In France, pre-revolutionary discourse tied the plight of the homeless to broader critiques of inequality. Yet for most of the century, concrete improvements were minimal. The poor continued to endure winters in crumbling cottages, overcrowded tenements, or open streets. While the wealthy enjoyed insulated comfort, the struggle for shelter in the 18th century is thus a story of survival at the margins. It reveals how housing, or the lack of it, determined life expectancy, shaped family structures, and defined the experience of winter itself. For the poor, shelter was never secure, never adequate, and often indistinguishable from exposure. Winter exposed this reality most brutally when the line between home and homelessness collapsed, leaving millions vulnerable to hunger, cold, and death. Winter in the 18th century was not only a season of cold, but also a season of silence in the labor market. Fields lay frozen, rivers locked under ice, and many trades that depended on warmth, mobility, or long daylight hours came to a halt. For the poor, this meant one thing above all: unemployment. In a world without savings, welfare systems, or reliable credit, the loss of wages during winter months could be catastrophic. Survival required resilience, improvisation, and reliance on fragile networks of support. Agricultural labor was the backbone of Europe's economy, and it was the first to feel the seasonal collapse. Peasants and day laborers worked in the rhythm of the land, sowing in spring, tending in summer, harvesting in autumn. But by November, tasks dwindled. Fields could not be plowed in frost, and harvests had been gathered. What remained were odd jobs, mending fences, repairing tools, tending animals, but these were limited and insufficient to provide steady income. For families who relied on day wages, the months between November and March were a time of scarcity, often referred to in parish records as the hungry season. Urban trades were no less vulnerable. Construction slowed or stopped altogether in severe winters. Masons, carpenters, and roofers found little employment when frost hardened ground and snow weighed down rooftops. Transport workers suffered as well. Frozen rivers halted barges, while snow-blocked roads limited wagon traffic. Merchants complained of fewer customers as markets shrank, leaving apprentices and shopboys underemployed. Even skilled artisans, weavers, spinners, and tailors faced reduced demand as households curtailed spending on clothing when food and fuel consumed all available income. The collapse in employment meant not just hardship, but hunger. Wages in the 18th century were already meager, often spent daily on bread, fuel, and rent. With little capacity to save, workers entered winter with few reserves. Parish reports from across Europe described families living from crust to crust, their income exhausted before the coldest months had even begun. In England, agricultural wages fell by as much as half in winter, leaving many dependent on parish relief. In France, rural laborers survived on credit from local bakers, a fragile arrangement that collapsed during years of poor harvest. Fuel shortages compounded the crisis. Work was sometimes available, cutting wood or transporting coal, but demand far outstripped supply. The price of firewood soared in harsh winters, forcing the poor to spend what little they earned on meager bundles. In cities, some scavenged sawdust, peat scraps, or dung to sell in markets, an exhausting and poorly paid trade. For women, the most common winter work was laundry, sewing, or selling kindling, but such tasks brought pennies rather than sustenance. Children entered the labor force early, fetching water, selling matches, or sweeping streets. Their small incomes critical to family survival. Unemployment bred desperation, and desperation often led to unrest. Food riots frequently erupted in winter, when grain prices soared and wages fell. In the 1740s, Paris saw repeated bread riots as unemployed workers and their families protested scarcity. In England, the Captain Swing disturbances of the later century were rooted partly in the frustrations of rural workers deprived of winter wages. These uprisings were rarely organized revolutions, but immediate responses to hunger, crowds demanding bread, breaking into granaries, or forcing merchants to sell at just prices. Winter was the spark that ignited such fury. As households pushed beyond endurance, parish relief provided one of the few safety nets, though it was uneven and stigmatized. In England, the poor laws required parishes to provide some support to the destitute. Winter relief often took the form of bread, coal, or small sums of money, but assistance depended on parish resources, which varied widely and came with conditions. Applicants were interrogated about their work habits, morality, and deservingness. Able-bodied men were often refused aid on the grounds that they should seek employment, even when none existed. Relief was thus both lifeline and humiliation, a system designed to sustain survival while discouraging dependence. Alternative survival strategies filled the gaps. Rural families gathered acorns, chestnuts, or roots to supplement diets, turning to foraging when wages failed. Urban households scavenged refuse or begged in streets, relying on charity from wealthier neighbors. Seasonal migration provided another option. Some laborers moved to regions with milder winters or better employment opportunities, though travel in snow was perilous. Women, in particular, developed small-scale survival economies, knitting stockings, brewing cheap beer, or selling baked goods that kept households afloat. These strategies reveal resilience, but they also expose the fragility of survival in a wage-dependent society. The cycle of winter unemployment also reinforced inequality. Wealthy landowners and merchants could stockpile resources and employ servants year-round, insulating themselves from seasonal fluctuations. The poor, by contrast, lived at the mercy of markets and weather. Even skilled artisans found themselves trapped as guild protections waned and competition grew. In France, journeyman carpenters complained in petitions of being unable to secure work during long winters, blaming both climate and employers. Across Europe, the seasonal rhythm of unemployment ensured that poverty was not an aberration but a recurring, predictable reality for the majority. The impact on families was profound. With fathers unemployed, mothers bore greater responsibility for securing food. Children's labor became critical, and education, where available, often lapsed as winter survival took precedence. Malnutrition weakened entire households, making them more vulnerable to disease. In diaries and parish records, winter emerges repeatedly as the season when families fractured, children sent to live with relatives, elderly parents abandoned to almshouses, or households falling into debt that would shape their futures for years. The Enlightenment brought new attention to these dynamics. Economists like Adam Smith recognized the cyclical nature of poverty, linking unemployment and hunger to the structure of agrarian economies. Philanthropists argued for winter employment schemes, such as road building or public works, to provide income for the poor. In some regions, authorities experimented with subsidized grain sales or fuel distribution during harsh winters. These measures reflected a growing awareness that seasonal poverty was not just a private misfortune, but a public problem with political consequences. Despite such efforts, the poor remained trapped in a recurring pattern: work in summer, hunger in winter. This rhythm shaped the culture of poverty, embedding caution, endurance, and communal sharing into everyday life. Winter was not merely a backdrop, but a defining feature of social existence, the moment when survival itself was most at risk. The struggle for wages, or for the means to replace them, was the thread that bound together the experience of poverty across Europe by the end of the 18th century. Industrialization began to alter this cycle in some regions. Factories provided year-round employment, though often at low wages and in brutal conditions. Coal mining expanded, offering winter work but at great physical cost. These changes did not eliminate poverty, but they reshaped its patterns, replacing seasonal unemployment with chronic exploitation. Still, for most of the century, winter remained synonymous with lost wages, scarce food, and desperate improvisation. The story of work and wages in winter is a story of fragility. It reveals how quickly livelihoods could vanish with the change of season, how families balanced on the edge of survival, and how societies alternately ignored, punished, or aided their poor. It is also a reminder that poverty was not an accident of individual failure, but a structural condition, reinforced by economic rhythms beyond the control of those who suffered them. In the 18th century, to be poor in winter was to live at the mercy of forces far larger than oneself: the weather, the harvest, the market, and to hope that spring would come before hunger claimed another life. In the 18th century, warmth was not a luxury, it was survival. And for the poor, survival hinged on a commodity more precious in winter than bread: firewood. Every flicker of flame meant hours without freezing, meals made edible, and rooms made livable. But as Europe's population grew and forests dwindled, the price of wood soared beyond the reach of the poor. Winter transformed firewood into an economy of desperation, where scarcity, theft, and bitter inequality revealed the sharpest edges of survival. For most Europeans, wood was the dominant source of fuel. Coal existed, especially in England and parts of the Low Countries, but its extraction and transport were limited. Peasants in rural France, Germany, Poland, and Scandinavia relied almost entirely on local forests for heating and cooking. Villagers maintained ancient rights to gather brushwood or deadfall, known as commons rights. But as population increased and landlords enclosed forests for profit, these rights eroded. By the early 1700s, rural communities were already complaining of dwindling supplies, forcing families to burn straw, dung, or even furniture during hard winters. The rise in wood prices was dramatic. Records from Paris show that in the harsh winter of 1709, firewood prices doubled within weeks, consuming more than half of a laborer's daily wages. In Vienna, bundles of kindling fetched prices normally reserved for bread. In London, despite the growing coal trade, wood for kindling and cooking remained costly, particularly for those too poor to buy coal in bulk. Winter magnified these pressures. Demand soared as rivers froze, blocking transport, and snow made carting difficult. The poor, who could never stockpile enough in advance, paid the steepest prices, Inequality was written in the hearth. The wealthy stocked wood yards and filled coal cellars before winter. Their estates consumed enormous amounts of timber, with fires burning in multiple rooms, kitchens running constantly, and stables heated for valuable animals. Meanwhile, the poor relied on a single hearth, often kept dark for lack of fuel. Diaries from the period record families sitting in freezing rooms, huddled under blankets, while firewood sellers passed through the streets, their loads destined for richer households. For the poor, the sight of stacked logs behind wealthy gates was a bitter reminder of inequality that winter made visible. Desperation bred conflict, with theft became one of the most common winter crimes. Peasants cut branches from forbidden forests, stripped hedgerows, or stole from landlords' stores. Court records across Europe revealed prosecutions for wood pilfering during every severe winter. In France, forest guards patrolled heavily during January and February, confronting women and children gathering twigs. Punishments could be harsh: fines, imprisonment, even public whipping, yet theft persisted, driven by the elemental need to keep warm. In England, enclosure laws restricted access to commons, sparking riots where villagers tore down fences to reclaim wood rights. Charity sometimes intervened. Parishes in England distributed coal tickets to the poor, allowing them to purchase fuel at subsidized prices. In France, confraternities organized winter distributions of firewood, carting bundles to the homes of widows and orphans. Wealthy nobles staged acts of generosity, opening their woodyards to villagers in times of crisis. But these efforts were sporadic, insufficient to meet need, and often symbolic as much as practical. For most of the poor, charity provided brief respite, not sustained warmth. Alternative fuels reflected both ingenuity and desperation. Dung, both animal and human, was dried and burned, though it produced little heat and foul odors. Peat, abundant in Ireland, Holland, and parts of Germany, provided a more effective substitute, but digging and drying it was labor-intensive and seasonal. Crop residues, straw, husks, and stalks were pressed into fuel cakes. In cities, the poor scavenged refuse, broken barrels, crates, or construction waste. In some cases, they dismantled abandoned houses for beams and planks. These fuels were smoky, inefficient, and unhealthy, yet they marked the difference between freezing and surviving. The fuel crisis also shaped daily rhythms. Without wood, cooking became limited. Meals shifted to foods that required little or no heating. Bread, cold porridge, raw vegetables. Families gathered around single fires, restricting activity to the warmest corner of the house. In villages, communal ovens provided temporary relief as families baked together to conserve fuel. In cities, taverns and bakehouses became winter refuges, offering warmth for the price of a meal or drink. The scarcity of wood thus reshaped not only survival but also the patterns of social life. The environmental consequences of wood scarcity were Europe's forests, heavily exploited for centuries, dwindled under the pressure of population growth, shipbuilding, and industry. Deforestation accelerated soil erosion and altered local climates, further aggravating the poor's vulnerability. By the mid-18th century, reformers like Hans Carl von Carlowitz in Saxony began advocating for sustainable forestry, an early recognition that indiscriminate cutting threatened both economy and survival. Yet such measures primarily served the interests of states and industries, not peasants. For the rural poor, restrictions on forest use tightened their dependence on fragile fuel markets. regional differences mattered. England, with its expanding coal trade, was less dependent on wood than much of continental Europe. Barges carried Newcastle coal to London, where it became the primary urban fuel. Yet coal's cost and bulk limited its accessibility to the very poor, who could not afford large purchases or lacked storage space. On the continent, coal was scarce outside mining regions, and wood remained dominant. Scandinavia, with larger forests and smaller populations, fared better, though even there, poor households struggled when snow blocked access to supplies. The psychological burden of fuel poverty was immense. Diaries, sermons, and parish letters repeatedly described the despair of households with empty hearths. Fire was not only practical but symbolic, the center of family life, the mark of dignity and stability. To sit in darkness and cold was to feel excluded from the warmth of society itself. Winter without firewood reduced survival to its starkest terms, endurance without comfort, existence without security. By the end of the 18th century, industrialization and coal gradually eased some of these pressures in urban centers, though rural areas remained wood-dependent well into the 19th century. The transition did not eliminate inequality. Instead, it shifted it, as coal mining created new forms of labor, exploitation, and environmental degradation. But in the 18th century, for the vast majority of Europe's poor, survival in winter still depended on a bundle of firewood, its price, its availability, and its protection by laws that favored the powerful over the desperate. The story of firewood is thus the story of survival itself. It reveals how poverty was lived, not in abstract numbers, but in cold rooms, smoky huts, and desperate thefts in frozen forests. It shows how inequality was measured not only in wealth, but in warmth, in who could light multiple fires and who shivered in darkness. For the poor of 18th century Europe, the price of firewood was not merely economic, it was existential. If firewood was the ancient lifeline of Europe's poor, the 18th century introduced another, darker fuel, coal. It promised warmth and endurance through the harshest winters, but it also carried dangers of health, of environment, and of access. For the poor, coal was both salvation and curse, a resource that could extend survival but at the cost of choking air, hazardous work, and constant uncertainty. Alongside coal, the struggle to afford light, candles, rushlights, and oil added another dimension to winter poverty. Warmth and illumination, taken for granted by the wealthy, were fragile and costly for those on the margins. Coal's importance rose first in Britain. By 1700, the coal trade of Newcastle upon Tyne was one of the largest in Europe, supplying London through fleets of ships that sailed down the North Sea. Barges carried thousands of tons each year, unloading at the capital's wharves, where merchants sold coal in bulk. Unlike wood, coal could not be casually gathered or stolen. It was an industrial commodity, mined deep underground and distributed through commercial networks. For London's growing population, coal became the dominant household fuel. By the mid-18th century, it was nearly impossible to imagine the city without its coal smoke, a haze so constant that visitors called it the London fog. But coal spread was uneven. On the European continent, it remained scarce outside of mining regions like the Ruhr, the Saar, or Silesia. Most peasants in France, Germany, Italy, or Poland continued to rely on wood. Transport difficulties, high costs, and limited infrastructure made coal inaccessible to the majority. Even in England, where coal was abundant, the poorest struggled to afford it. Coal was sold by the cartload or sack, quantities too large and expensive for those living hand to mouth. Families unable to pay up front for bulk purchases resorted to scavenging small lumps dropped from carts or stealing from wharves. In this way, coal widened the gulf between those who could stockpile and those who could only scavenge. Health consequences were severe. Coal smoke filled homes with soot and toxic fumes, particularly in poorly ventilated cottages. Families who could afford only small quantities often used them in inefficient stoves or open grates, producing clouds of choking black smoke. Respiratory disease was common. Bronchitis, asthma, and chronic coughs plagued households that relied on coal but lacked chimneys suited to burn it cleanly. In London, physicians remarked on the prevalence of sooty lungs among both poor families and coal workers. Children raised in coal-burning districts suffered stunted growth and recurring illness. Their survival a constant battle against both cold and pollution. The dangers began at the source. Coal mining was among the most dangerous occupations of the century, employing thousands of men and boys in perilous conditions. Mines were dark, wet, and prone to collapse. Explosions of fire-damp methane gas killed entire crews, while long hours bent bodies and damaged lungs. Child labor was central to the industry. Boys as young as 8 hauled coal carts through narrow seams, crawling in darkness for 12 or more hours a day. Wages were low, but families depended on them, for coal was both livelihood and necessity. The poor thus endured a cruel paradox. They extracted the fuel that warmed Europe, yet often froze themselves for lack of money to buy it. Even those who had coal could not escape its risks. Fires were frequent in coal-heated homes, as sparks and embers leapt from poorly managed grates. Chimneys clogged with soot ignited easily, destroying tenements already fragile from overcrowding. Insurance companies in 18th century London began charging higher rates for houses using coal, acknowledging the danger. Yet coal's efficiency compared to wood ensured its spread, for no other fuel could match its caloric output per load. For those who could afford it, coal meant survival in winters that would otherwise have been unendurable. Light posed a parallel struggle. Candles were essential in the long nights of winter, but for the poor, they were costly luxuries. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were cheaper than beeswax, but burned with smoke and stench. Rushlights reeds dipped in tallow provided minimal illumination, flickering weakly and burning out within an hour. Poor households rationed light carefully, often limiting its use to evenings for cooking or sewing. Children studied by the dim glow of rushlights, if at all, while families retired early to conserve fuel. Darkness defined winter as much as cold, shaping rhythms of work, rest, and survival. The wealthy, by contrast, lit their homes with multiple candles or oil lamps, creating spaces of warmth and brightness unimaginable to the poor. Illuminated salons and banquet halls became symbols of privilege, their extravagance contrasting sharply with the single smoking wick of a peasant's hut. Public lighting, introduced in some cities by the mid-18th century, offered marginal relief. Paris installed thousands of oil lamps, while London adopted lanterns along major streets. But for the poor, these were external displays, not domestic comforts. Home remained a place of shadow, punctuated by brief, rationed bursts of light. The scarcity of light and fuel reshaped patterns of labor. Women spun, knitted, and mended clothes by candlelight, their tasks slowed by weak illumination. Markets and workshops adjusted hours to daylight, reducing employment opportunities during winter. For many, darkness meant idleness, not leisure but enforced inactivity. A reminder of the poverty that limited access to even the most basic resources. Diaries from the period often lament the long, dark nights when families sat silently in cold rooms, conserving both fuel and light, waiting for dawn. Despite hardships, trade in fuel and candles became a significant part of urban economies. Peddlers sold bundles of kindling, sacks of coal dust, or single candles in marketplaces. Some households mixed coal dust with clay to form briquettes, sold cheaply to those unable to buy solid coal. Women and children frequently took part in these markets, their meager profits contributing to family survival. In the poorest districts, candles were sometimes rented, shared among neighbors for communal tasks like reading letters or mending clothes. This economy of fragments reflects both the creativity and the desperation of poor communities in the 18th century. Religious and cultural dimensions also marked the use of light and fuel. Candles burned in churches symbolized divine presence, even as parishioners at home lacked enough light to read scripture. Wealthy households displayed abundance through candlelit festivities, reinforcing social hierarchies. For the poor, the absence of light and warmth became part of their cultural identity, reinforcing their exclusion from spaces of privilege. Winter festivals like Christmas highlighted this divide, as illuminated city squares contrasted with dark, cold homes at the edges of society. By the end of the century, industrial advances promised change. Improved stoves, more efficient chimneys, and cheaper coal distribution expanded access in some regions. Whale oil and later gas lighting began to alter urban illumination. But these developments remained distant for much of Europe's poor, who entered the 19th century facing the same stark realities. Coal dust in their lungs, candles rationed to the hour, and the endless challenge of surviving another winter with too little fuel and too little light. The story of coal and candles is thus inseparable from the story of poverty in the 18th century. It reveals the constant balancing act of the poor, between warmth and suffocation, between light and darkness, between survival and despair. Where the wealthy saw fire and light as comforts, the poor experienced them as precarious privileges. Winter laid bare this divide, transforming coal, dust, and candle smoke into enduring symbols of inequality in an age when survival itself depended on what could be burned. If hunger and cold did not claim lives directly, disease often did. The 18th century's poor were not only vulnerable to starvation and exposure, they were also exposed to illnesses that thrived in the very conditions winter created. Malnutrition weakened bodies, crowded housing spread contagion, and cold dampened immune defenses. Winter epidemics became as feared as famine, shaping the demographic and cultural reality of an age when health was fragile, medicine limited, and survival never guaranteed. The link between cold and disease was well recognized by contemporaries, even if medical explanations remained incomplete. Physicians of the period believed that frigid air encouraged humors to stagnate, breeding illness. Poor households experienced this most directly. Their cottages and tenements, overcrowded and poorly ventilated, were breeding grounds for respiratory infections. The combination of damp, soot-filled air from fires and constant exposure to cold winds created a perfect environment for bronchitis, pneumonia, and tuberculosis. These diseases were not confined to adults. Infants and children, already weakened by hunger, suffered most severely. Tuberculosis, known as consumption, was among the deadliest. It thrived in environments of malnutrition and overcrowding, making the poor especially vulnerable. In winter, when food scarcity peaked and houses closed their shutters against the cold, the disease spread with devastating speed. Parish burial registers across Europe show spikes in deaths from decline during January and February, reflecting the harsh synergy between cold and contagion. For poor families, a persistent cough was often a harbinger of death, and few had the means to afford treatment beyond ineffective herbal remedies or prayer. Smallpox was another scourge that struck relentlessly in winter months. Though it did not depend on cold directly, the season's close quarters made outbreaks more severe. Children bore the brunt of this disease, which scarred survivors and killed many more. In Paris, records from the mid-18th century show that smallpox accounted for up to 1/3 of child deaths in some years. In England, before the spread of inoculation, winter outbreaks could decimate entire villages. The poor, with little access to medical care, faced mortality rates far higher than the wealthy, whose resources provided isolation, nursing, and increasingly inoculation. Typhus, known as jail fever, also flourished in cold seasons. Spread by lice, it thrived where poor families huddled together in unwashed clothes and bedding, often sharing quarters with animals. Overcrowded tenements, workhouses, and prisons became epicenters of outbreaks, which spilled into broader society during harsh winters. Typhus killed quickly, with fever, rash, and delirium, and it carried a high mortality rate. Chroniclers of the 1740 famine in Ireland described entire families perishing from the spotted fever in freezing huts. For the poor, lice were a constant companion, and in winter, when washing was nearly impossible, infestations became lethal. Measles and influenza joined this litany of seasonal killers. Measles epidemics swept through Europe at intervals, striking children in particular. Influenza, poorly understood at the time, spread rapidly in the cold months, carried along trade routes and military campaigns. Outbreaks in the early 1700s reached pandemic proportions, killing thousands across multiple countries. For the poor, these diseases struck with compounded force. As weakened bodies and cramped housing provided little defense, nutrition played a decisive role. Malnutrition undermined immune defenses, leaving the poor susceptible to every contagion. Winter diets were meager: bread, gruel, and occasional roots or dried beans. Meat was rare, milk often unavailable, and vegetables nearly absent. Deficiencies in vitamins weakened resistance, particularly to respiratory disease. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency, left children with fragile bones, a condition worsened by the lack of sunlight in winter. Scurvy, though more often associated with sailors, also appeared inland during harsh winters when fresh food disappeared. For the poor, hunger was not just emptiness of stomach, but a pathway to illness. Workhouses and almshouses illustrate the deadly intersection of poverty, crowding, and cold. These institutions, intended to provide shelter, often became death traps during winter epidemics. Records from English workhouses describe dozens of inmates dying within weeks of influenza outbreaks, with fevers spreading through shared dormitories. In Paris' Hôpital General, mortality soared during January and February, when poor relief swelled the population beyond capacity. Disease turned charity into catastrophe, with institutions unable to cope with the influx of the desperate. The wealthy were not immune to disease, but their risks were lower. They lived in larger houses with more ventilation, had access to physicians, and could isolate themselves during outbreaks. Inoculation against smallpox, though dangerous, became increasingly popular among elite families in the mid-18th century, reducing mortality for their children. The poor, by contrast, rarely had the choice, facing not only higher exposure but fewer defenses. Disease thus reinforced social inequality, as survival became as much a matter of wealth as of chance. The cultural perception of disease was shaped by religion and morality. Illness was often interpreted as divine punishment, particularly in Catholic regions where sermons linked epidemics to sin. For the poor, such interpretations carried an added burden, framing their suffering as both material and moral failure. In Protestant regions, disease was framed more often as a test of endurance, though charity was also emphasized. Yet across Europe, winter epidemics inspired both fear and fatalism, as communities recognized their limited power against forces that seemed beyond human control. Medicine offered little relief. Physicians of the 18th century lacked effective treatments for most diseases. Bloodletting, purges, and herbal concoctions remained common, with questionable results. The poor rarely had access to trained doctors at all, relying instead on midwives, local healers, or folk remedies. Inoculation against smallpox marked one of the few genuine advances, but it spread slowly and unevenly, resisted by both fear and cost. For most of the poor, illness meant waiting either for recovery or for death. The demographic impact of winter disease was profound. Mortality rates soared in January and February, shaping population growth and family structures. In regions already burdened by famine, epidemics could reduce populations by significant percentages in a single year. Parish registers testify to waves of burials in winter months, names clustered in tragic succession. Families lost children, parents, or entire households, leaving communities scarred. These cycles of disease reinforce the perception of winter as a season of death. Etched into cultural memory and religious practice by the close of the 18th century, reformers and Enlightenment thinkers began to connect the dots between poverty, environment, and disease. Physicians and philanthropists argued that poor housing, malnutrition, and inadequate sanitation were not just private misfortunes but public dangers. Campaigns for inoculation spread, particularly in England, though resistance remained strong. The seeds of public health reform were planted in these decades, though true advances would not come until the 19th century. For the poor of the 1700s, however, disease remained an inescapable reality of winter, a force that claimed lives as inexorably as cold or hunger. The story of disease in the cold is not separate from the story of poverty. It is integral to it. It reveals how environmental hardship translated into biological vulnerability, how hunger and shelterlessness became pathways for epidemics. It also shows how inequality extended beyond comfort and survival to health itself, dividing those who lived and those who died. In the 18th century, winter was not just a season of cold, but a season of contagion, when the frailest were tested and too often lost.
In the 18th century, when hunger and cold pressed hardest, the poor often turned to one institution above all others, the church. Across Europe, parishes, monasteries, and religious confraternities stood at the center of charitable relief. For the destitute, the sound of church bells in winter was more than a call to worship. It was a faint promise of bread, coal, or alms. Charity was uneven, shaped by theology, resources, and local custom, but it was indispensable. Without it, countless more would have perished in the bitterest months. Charity was not an invention of the 18th century, but its role took on sharper urgency in an age of famine, epidemic, and relentless winters. Christian teaching placed almsgiving at the core of moral duty. To give to the poor was to imitate Christ, and to withhold was to risk eternal judgment. Sermons thundered against indifference, reminding the wealthy that their salvation might hinge on a coin dropped into an outstretched hand. Yet charity was never unconditional. It was entangled with ideas of morality, deservingness, and social order. In Catholic Europe, confraternities and brotherhoods organized seasonal relief. In cities like Paris, Naples, and Madrid, lay religious groups distributed loaves of bread, bowls of soup, or bundles of firewood. Feast days such as Christmas or St. Martin's Day often included public almsgiving, with long lines of the poor filing past churches to receive small portions. Monasteries opened their kitchens to feed dozens daily, particularly during harsh winters. For widows, orphans, and the sick, these rituals of relief meant survival, even if only for a day. Parish priests were key intermediaries. They knew which families were most destitute, which widows had no support, which children had lost parents. In France, parish registers record distributions of pain Bennett, blessed bread, to needy families after Sunday Massachusetts. In Spain, alms were often tied to religious processions, with the act of giving reinforced communal bonds. In Italy, confraternities operated soup kitchens and piazzas, feeding both locals and migrants. Relief was infused with ritual, binding charity to piety in a visible, performative way. Protestant regions offered charity through different structures, but with similar intent. In England and parts of Germany, parish overseers administered poor relief funds financed by local taxes. In Scotland, the Kirk session played this role, collecting offerings and distributing them to parishioners in need. Relief was formalized but also tightly controlled, with overseers questioning applicants about their work, conduct, and worthiness. The language of deserving versus undeserving poor became central, shaping who received aid and who was turned away. This distinction reflected deeper anxieties. The deserving poor, widows, orphans, the elderly, and the infirm, were recognized as legitimate objects of charity. The undeserving poor, able-bodied men and women judged idle, were often excluded or directed to workhouses. Winter intensified the cruelty of this logic, as agricultural and seasonal laborers found themselves unemployed through no fault of their own. Yet officials still insisted they seek employment, denying relief to those left with no real options. The church was both lifeline and gatekeeper, offering sustenance while reinforcing moral boundaries. Soup kitchens emerged as vital institutions in many cities. In Paris, the soup de pauvres provided hot meals during severe winters, serving lines of men, women, and children with bowls of broth and bread. Similar kitchens appeared in Vienna, Madrid, and London, often attached to monasteries or parish halls. Though portions were meager, the warmth of food in a frozen season could mean the difference between life and death. Contemporary observers noted how entire families queued in snow, bowls in hand, waiting for sustenance that lasted mere minutes. Firewood distributions were equally critical. In London, charitable societies collected donations to provide coal tickets to poor. Beneficiaries could redeem these for small supplies of coal, easing the burden of heating. In rural France, landlords occasionally donated cartloads of firewood to their tenants, though often with an expectation of loyalty in return. In Germany, Protestant parishes organized wholesome Lungen, communal wood gathering for the benefit of the destitute. Such relief was highly symbolic. Warmth itself became an act of charity, echoing the Christian metaphor of light against darkness. Charity also extended to institutions for the most vulnerable. Foundling hospitals, orphanages, and almshouses operated on donations, offering refuge to those abandoned or without kin. Yet these institutions were overwhelmed in winter, when poverty swelled their numbers. Mortality inside was high, but for many, they were the only alternative to the streets. Wealthy benefactors gained prestige from funding such establishments, their generosity celebrated in church records and public inscriptions. For the poor, institutional charity was less about generosity than survival, however precarious, however conditional. The cultural role of charity was profound. Public acts of almsgiving reinforced social hierarchies, reminding both rich and poor their respective places. For the wealthy, it was a demonstration of piety and authority. For the poor, it was a ritualized dependence. Winter dramatized this relationship, as the line between life and death often ran to the hand of a priest, a confraternity, or a landlord. Charity alleviated suffering, but also perpetuated inequality, sustaining the poor while ensuring their continued subordination. Critics recognize these contradictions. Enlightenment thinkers such as Voltaire and Condorcet questioned whether sporadic almsgiving truly addressed poverty's roots. In England, reformers debated whether parish relief created dependency rather than stability, yet others defended charity as essential, warning that without it, unrest and disorder would grow. Winter riots over bread and fuel often confirmed this fear, pushing authorities to encourage almsgiving as both a moral duty and a tool of social control. Despite its limitations, charity saved lives. Parish records across Europe testify to distributions of bread, coal, and clothing during harsh winters, gestures that carried countless families through the season. In famine years such as 1709 or 1740, charity, however small, was often a thin thread preventing total collapse. The memory of such acts lingered in local folklore and family stories, shaping how communities remember the role of the church in times of trial. Charity in the 18th century was thus both fragile and indispensable. It could not erase poverty, but it softened its edges. It could not prevent hunger, but it delayed death. It could not alter inequality, but it preserved social peace. For the poor, winter charity was not a gift. It was a lifeline, unpredictable, inadequate, and laden with moral judgment, but nonetheless a chance to endure another season of cold. When hunger gnawed and frost refused to relent, desperation often turned into fury. In 18th century Europe, winters were not only seasons of silence and endurance, they were also seasons of rebellion. Crowds of the poor, driven by starvation and despair, took to the streets demanding bread, fuel, or justice. These were not abstract outbursts, but visceral expressions of survival, born from months of deprivation. Riots and revolts became recurring features of Europe's harsh winters, leaving behind a legacy of fear in the hearts of rulers and hope in the memory of the poor. Food was at the center of most winter unrest. Bread, the staple of European diets, was both symbol and necessity. When prices rose beyond reach, the poor had little choice but to protest. Grain shortages, worsened by failed harvests and freezing weather, pushed bakers to raise prices or close their shops. Crowds gathered, accusing merchants of hoarding or profiteering. In Paris, bread riots erupted repeatedly in the first half of the 18th century, with mobs storming bakeries and markets. The cry of "Du pain, du pain," echoed through streets where families had gone days without food. In London, similar tensions unfolded. Winter grain shortages often sparked riots in marketplaces. Poor women, usually at the forefront, overturned carts, seized loaves, and demanded that prices be lowered. Authorities sometimes looked the other way, recognizing that such riots were not political conspiracies, but acts of survival. At other times, the response was harsh. Soldiers were called in, arrests were made, and punishment was swift. The uncertainty of response made winter protests volatile, balancing between tolerance and repression. Riots were not confined to great cities. Rural villages, too, erupted when famine loomed. In southern Germany during the famine winter of 1770 to 1771, peasants attacked grain stores, accusing landlords of exporting food while locals starved. In Ireland during the famine of 1740 to 1741, freezing conditions and crop failures led to widespread unrest. Crowds raided mills, looted markets, and demanded relief from landlords and clergy. In Naples, bread riots became almost seasonal, a grim ritual of winter poverty. These uprisings were often led by women. As guardians of household food, women bore the brunt of scarcity and were quickest to act. They demanded fair prices, shamed merchants, and sometimes seized supplies for redistribution. Their participation gave riots both moral weight and greater visibility, making it harder for authorities to dismiss them as mere lawlessness. Chroniclers frequently remarked on the centrality of women in these protests, noting how their desperation for children's survival transformed markets into battlegrounds. Fuel riots also mark harsh winters. In London, the high cost of coal drove the poor to seize deliveries from carts or wharves. In Paris, which shortages led to attacks on merchants accused of hoarding. These protests underscored how survival depended not only on bread, but also on the ability to keep warm. Winter turned fuel into a political issue, sharpening tensions between the poor and those who control resources. Authorities feared these uprisings not only for their disruption, but for their symbolism. Winter riots highlighted the fragility of order in times of scarcity. They revealed the power of the crowd, capable of overwhelming markets, disrupting trade, and challenging authority. Governments across Europe experimented with strategies to prevent unrest. Price controls, grain imports, charitable distributions, and harsh punishments for rioters. Yet none could erase the underlying cycle of scarcity and protest. Sometimes riots escalated into broader revolts. In France, the grain riots of the 18th century foreshadowed the larger upheavals of the Revolution. The memory of winter hunger fed political anger, turning demand for bread into demand for rights. In Ireland, famine-driven unrest fostered resentment against landlords and the English crown, laying groundwork for future nationalist movements. In Central Europe, peasant revolts linked to hunger and taxation challenged feudal obligations. Winter, with its relentless pressures, became a catalyst for social change as well as survival. The cultural memory of riots was powerful. For the poor, they represented moments of collective resistance, when communities stood together against hunger. For the wealthy, they were warnings, reminders of how quickly desperation could turn into revolt. Newspapers, pamphlets, and official reports describe these uprisings in vivid detail, spreading fear among elites and sympathy among reformers. In this way, winter unrest shaped not only immediate outcomes, but also broader debates about poverty, justice, and governance. Yet revolts and riots were not constant victories. Punishment was often brutal. Rioters could be flogged, imprisoned, or hanged. Leaders were singled out for harsh sentences to deter others. Soldiers patrolled marketplaces, and spies reported on gatherings. The poor knew the risks, but often felt they had no alternative. To riot was to gamble survival against repression, a gamble many felt compelled to take when hunger outweighed fear. By the end of the 18th century, authorities increasingly recognized that addressing poverty was a more effective strategy than repression alone. Some governments expanded grain reserves, established price controls, or organized winter relief. The French crown under Louis XVI attempted to manage grain supplies more carefully after repeated riots. In Britain, philanthropic societies provided bread and coal during harsh winters. These measures reflected both compassion and calculation. Keeping the poor alive reduced the risk of revolt. The story of winter riots is thus not only one of chaos, but a negotiation. Crowds pushed back against scarcity, sometimes successfully forcing prices down or securing supplies. Authorities balanced fear of disorder with fear of appearing weak. Communities remembered these clashes as proof of both vulnerability and agency. In the harshest months, when hunger threatened to silence voices, Riots gave the poor a means to be heard. Winter revolts revealed the political dimension of poverty. They show that hunger was not a private misfortune but a public issue, one that drew communities into conflict with markets, landlords, and governments. They also demonstrate how survival strategies extended beyond the individual household to collective action, where neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder in defiance of despair. In the 18th century, to riot for bread was not only to fight hunger, but to challenge the structures that allowed hunger to persist. In the harsh winters of the 18th century, the burden of survival fell with particular cruelty on children. They were the most vulnerable to hunger, disease, and cold, yet they were also indispensable to their families' efforts to endure. Winter shaped their lives from the moment of birth to the edge of adulthood, determining whether they would survive, whether they would work, and how they would grow. In an age when childhood was fragile even in the best of seasons, winter transformed it into a perilous passage. Mortality among children was staggering. Across Europe, nearly 1 in 3 infants died before reaching their first birthday, and many more before the age of 5. Winter accounted for a disproportionate share of these deaths. Cold air, damp houses, and weak nutrition left infants highly susceptible to respiratory infections. Mothers struggled to keep newborns warm, wrapping them in layers of cloth or swaddling, but fires often could not be kept burning through the night. Parish registers from France, England, and Germany reveal spikes in infant burials during January and February, silent testimony to the relentlessness of winter mortality. For those who survived infancy, childhood was no guarantee of safety. Hunger was constant. Children of poor families were fed last, after parents and older siblings. Bread crusts, watered gruel, and scraps from markets sustained them. In famine years, malnutrition left children stunted, with swollen bellies and weakened limbs. Physicians of the time described winter fevers that carried off the young in waves, often the direct consequence of starvation, combined with cold. Families grieved but rarely had the luxury of extended mourning. Survival demanded relentless focus on the living. Children were also workers. From as early as 5 or 6, they contributed to household survival, particularly in winter when every effort counted. In rural areas, children collected firewood, herded animals, or fetched water, often walking long distances through snow and ice. In towns and cities, they hawked goods in markets, carried coal, or served as apprentices. Wages were meager, but even a child's pennies might buy a candle or a loaf of bread. In coal mining regions, boys as young as 8 worked underground, hauling carts in freezing, damp shafts. Winter did not excuse them. It intensified their labor. Abandonment was another grim reality. In periods of famine and extreme cold, parents unable to feed their children sometimes left them at church doors, convents, or foundling hospitals. Institutions like the Hôpital d'Enfants Trouvé in Paris or the Foundling Hospital in London were overwhelmed each winter by infants left swaddled in rags. Mortality in these institutions was extremely high, often exceeding 50%. But for desperate parents, abandonment seemed the only chance of survival for their child. Winter was a season when these institutions saw their greatest influx, a tragic measure of collective desperation. Education, already rare for the poor, nearly disappeared in winter. Schools, where they existed, were cold and poorly supplied. Families often withdrew children to save on fees or redirect their labor toward survival tasks. The ideal of literacy and learning was a distant hope, overshadowed by the immediate need for warmth and food. Children who might otherwise have spent hours with books instead spent them gathering kindling, watching siblings, or selling goods in markets. Winter education for poor children was the education necessity, not of letters. Religion shaped children's experience of winter in profound ways. Churches organized catechism classes, distributed alms, and emphasized obedience, patience, and faith. Sermons reminded parents to see children as both blessings and burdens, entrusted to them by God, but testing their endurance. Festivals like Christmas offered brief moments of reprieve, with small gifts of bread or sweets distributed to the young. Yet even here, inequality was stark. Wealthy children celebrated with feasts and toys, while poor children looked on with empty hands. Winter thus reinforced social divides from the earliest years. Despite hardship, children were not passive victims. They developed survival strategies of their own. Groups of boys scavenged for coal along riverbanks, collecting lumps dropped from barges. Girls often scavenged food waste from markets, carrying it home in aprons. In some regions, children formed bands that begged or sang for alms, their presence tolerated more readily than that of adults. These small acts of resilience reflected not only desperation, but also ingenuity, as children learned quickly that their survival depended on resourcefulness. The memory of childhood winters lingered throughout life. Adults who survived recalled the hunger, cold, and labor of their early years, shaping attitudes toward work, family, and charity. Some became advocates for reform, driven by recollections of childhood deprivation. In England, philanthropists who founded the London Foundling Hospital were motivated by memories of abandoned infants in freezing streets. In France, Enlightenment thinkers pointed to child suffering as proof of the need for broader social change. Childhood winters and their cruelty seeded long-term current of empathy, reform, and sometimes anger. Winter's toll on children also exposed the limits of community support. Neighbors shared food, churches distributed alms, and extended families offered shelter, but in years of deep frost or famine, resources ran thin. Children, the weakest members of the poor, were the first to suffer when communal safety nets frayed. Their suffering was visible in parish records, in the cries of infants in orphanages, and in the skeletal forms seen by travelers in famine-stricken regions. The plight of children revealed the most intimate consequences of poverty, stripping survival down to its most basic terms. By the end of the 18th century, growing awareness of childhood vulnerability began to inspire more systematic responses. Foundling hospitals, though imperfect, expanded. Some governments introduced rudimentary measures to regulate child labor, though enforcement was minimal. Philanthropists argued that society had a responsibility to protect its young, not merely to pity them. The Enlightenment's emphasis on human dignity extended, unevenly, to children, framing them as subject of care rather than simply as miniature laborers. Yet for most poor children, change was slow, and winters remained deadly well into the 19th century. The story of children in winter is a story of contradiction, fragility and resilience, suffering and resourcefulness, abandonment and survival. It reveals how poverty shaped the youngest lives most profoundly, robbing many of future, but also producing the grit and endurance of those who survived. In the 18th century, winter was not just a season for children. It was a crucible that decided who would live, who would work, and who would be remembered only in a parish ledger. In the 18th century, winter was not simply a season of hardship. It was also an economic force. It reshaped markets, redefined labor, and reoriented trade in ways both visible and invisible. For the poor, survival often hinged on how well they could adapt to the shifting rhythms of the winter economy. Prices rose, employment dwindled, and entire communities reorganized their work and consumption to cope with scarcity. Winter was not only endured in private households, it was negotiated in markets, workshops, and streets, where the battle for survival was fought transaction by transaction. At the heart of the winter economy lay the grain market. Bread was a cornerstone of the European diet, and fluctuations in grain prices dictated the rhythm of daily life. When harvests failed or stocks ran low, the poor felt it first and most severely. Winter scarcity routinely drove up prices, sometimes doubling or tripling the cost of flour. Parish records from France, Italy, and England note waves of complaints in December and January as families struggled to stretch their meager coins against soaring costs. Bakers, caught between rising grain prices and desperate customers, became focal points of tension. Accusations of hoarding or profiteering were common, and riots often erupted at the bakery doors. Fuel formed the other cornerstone of the winter economy. Coal in Britain would across much of continental Europe, and peat in regions like the Low Countries all became commodities of survival. Merchants and peddlers sold fuel in small quantities, sacks of coal dust, bundles of sticks, or baskets of peat. In cities like London, Newcastle, and Paris, winter markets were filled with traders offering fuel at inflated prices, knowing the poor had no alternative. Families without the means to buy in bulk paid dearly, often sacrificing food money to keep fires burning. For those unable to afford fuel at all, scavenging became the only option, collecting scraps of wood, digging up roots, or gathering coal fragments along riverbanks. Seasonal labor was another defining feature. Agricultural work slowed or stopped during winter, leaving countless rural laborers unemployed. Families that survived on wages from planting, harvesting, or herding faced months with no income. Some sought alternative employment, mending tools, weaving cloth, or working in local markets. In urban centers, winter created demand for labor in trades tied to survival: chimney sweeping, fuel delivery, or tailoring. Children often took up small jobs, carrying water, selling kindling, or sweeping streets. These tasks provided pennies, but in aggregate, they formed an essential lifeline for poor households. Markets themselves transformed in winter. Stalls sold salted fish, dried beans, or root vegetables that could last through the season. Salted herring, in particular, became a staple of poor diets in Northern Europe, providing both sustenance and a rare source of protein. In Southern Europe, chestnuts and dried fruits filled a similar role. Markets also became hubs for second-hand goods. Old clothes, patched shoes, and broken tools were resold, with poor families bartering what little they had. The economy of reuse and repair intensified in winter, when new goods were out of reach and survival demanded resourcefulness. Credit and debt loomed over the winter economy. Few poor families could afford to buy fuel or food outright in bulk. Instead, they relied on credit extended by bakers, butchers, and merchants, promising to repay after spring labor resumed. The system bound the poor into cycles of dependence and vulnerability. A harsh winter could leave families deeply indebted, forcing them into years of repayment. In rural areas, peasants borrowed seed or grain from landlords, binding themselves obligations that shaped their labor long after snow melted. Winter thus extended its reach beyond the season itself, embedding hardship into the economic structures of the poor. Charitable and institutional relief also intersected with the winter economy. Parish distributions of bread, coal, or soup temporarily eased burdens, but they also reshaped markets. Prices often dropped slightly after large-scale charity, as demand lessened. Conversely, rumors of charitable distributions could draw crowds that overwhelmed resources, creating surges of desperation and conflict. Almshouses, workhouses, and foundling hospitals likewise absorbed some of the poorest, but their needs often exceeded capacity. The tension between institutional charity and market forces defined the precarious balance of survival each winter. Festivals and holy days added another dimension. Christmas and Carnival brought temporary surges in consumption, even among the poor. Families scraped together resources to buy a small piece of meat, extra candles, or wine for celebration. Markets responded with seasonal offerings, creating brief moments of festivity amid deprivation. Yet these were fragile respites, often plunging families deeper into debt as they borrowed to mark the season. The cycle of feast and famine was thus embedded in the winter economy, both sustaining morale and intensifying hardship. The wealthy navigated the winter economy from a position of strength. They bought grain and fuel in bulk, stocked their homes, and employed servants to manage supplies. They could afford luxuries like imported spices, coffee, and sugar, even in the coldest months. For them, winter markets were opportunity for display rather than survival. Yet their consumption shaped economies just as profoundly as the desperation of the poor, creating parallel markets that reflected stark inequalities. While the poor purchased rushlights and coarse bread, the rich purchased wax candles and fine wines, often from the same stalls. Transportation and trade played vital roles. Frozen rivers and snow-blocked roads could disrupt supply lines, worsening shortages. Grain shipments stalled, coal delivery slowed, and prices spiked. Communities dependent on imports were especially vulnerable. In Northern Europe, ports freezing over meant delays in herring shipments, cutting off a crucial food supply. Inland towns saw caravans delayed by snowdrifts, leaving markets bare. Winter thus exposed the fragility of early modern trade, reminding communities how easily nature could disrupt human economies. Despite these hardships, the winter economy fostered resilience and adaptation. Families found ways to stretch food, repair goods, and barter skills. Markets adjusted to demand, introducing cheaper substitutes or ration portions. Communities developed systems of mutual aid, pooling resources to purchase grain or fuel collectively. These adaptations reflected not only desperation but also ingenuity, a testament to the poor's ability to navigate the relentless pressures of survival. By the late 18th century, some reforms began to reshape the winter economy. Governments experimented with grain reserves, designed to stabilize prices in times of scarcity. Philanthropic societies in London and Paris distributed coal tickets or organized soup kitchens, easing the worst burdens. Enlightenment thinkers argue for more rational systems of trade and relief, criticizing the inefficiency of ad hoc charity. Yet these measures were uneven, and for most of the poor, winter remained a season of risk, where the economy worked less as a system of opportunity and more as a crucible of endurance. The winter economy of the 18th century reveals the intimate link between environment and survival. It shows how markets, labor, and trade were not abstract systems but lived realities, shaping who ate, who froze, and who endured. For the poor, every transaction, a loaf of bread, a bundle of sticks, a candle stub, carried existential weight. Winter stripped the economy to its essentials, exposing not only the fragility of supply, but also the resilience of those forced to survive on its margins. Winter in the 18th century was more than a season of cold. It was a teacher, a test, and a chronic reminder of vulnerability. For Europe's poor, survival depended not only on daily acts of endurance, but also on the memories of winters past and the preparations they inspired for winters to come. Communities carried forward lessons etched in hunger and frost, embedding them in rituals, traditions, and collective memory. The harshest winters left scars that shaped behavior for decades, becoming cautionary tales that framed how people thought about survival, charity, and social order. Endurance began with routine. Poor families entered each winter with strategies honed by years of experience. Food preservation was crucial. Drying beans, salting fish, storing root vegetables, and fermenting cabbage were acts of foresight performed in autumn. Even the poorest sought to put aside some reserves, however meager, knowing that January and February would stretch them thin. In rural households, women played central roles in this preparation, managing small supplies to last through the lean months. Yet preparation was always precarious. A poor harvest or early frost could undo an entire year's planning, leaving families relying on charity, credit, or chance. Communal endurance was equally important. Villages organized shared resources, from common fields to collective firewood gathering. Neighbors lent food, tools, or clothing, knowing that reciprocity was vital. Parish relief, however limited, was often administered with communal awareness. Overseers of the poor considered local knowledge when deciding who most needed aid. In some towns, guilds supported members through winter hardships, pooling funds for widows or unemployed workers. These systems of mutual aid reflected a recognition that survival was rarely an individual endeavor. The memory of severe winters shaped these practices profoundly. The Great Frost of 1709, for example, remained etched in European consciousness for generations. In France, where hundreds of thousands perished, parish priests referred to it in sermons decades later as divine punishment and warning. In Germany, chronicles described the frozen rivers, dead vines, and famine that followed, urging descendants never to forget. Families told stories of how ancestors survived on acorns, bark, or boiled leather, lessons retold as both caution and resilience. Memory transformed catastrophe into guidance, framing how communities approached each new winter. Winter memories also influenced politics. Authorities recognized the unrest sparked by scarcity and sought to prevent repeats of past crises. Grain reserves were established in some regions, inspired by memories of famine years. In England, debates about the poor laws frequently referenced past winters, using them as justification for reforms. In France, repeated bread riots reminded officials of the explosive potential of hunger, influencing policy in the decades leading up to the revolution. Memory made winter a political force, shaping how states managed both resources and populations. Religion framed endurance in ways both spiritual and practical. Sermons in Catholic and Protestant regions alike invoked winters past as tests of faith. The suffering of the poor was presented as both a trial and a reminder of the Christian duty of charity. Anniversaries of harsh winters sometimes became occasions for processions or prayers, embedding memory in ritual. Families preserved the memory of survival through religious practices as well, dedicating candles to saints who protected them through the frost, or naming children after holy figures invoked in famine years. Religion thus became a vessel for collective endurance, giving suffering both meaning and continuity. Folklore and oral traditions further preserved winter's memory. Tales of wolves entering villages, of rivers freezing solid, or bread riots became part of local identity. Songs and rhymes carried these memories across generations, embedding warnings in cultural form. In Scandinavia, proverbs reminded farmers to prepare for the wolf month, January, when hunger prowled hardest. In Italy, rural communities marked the Giorni della Merla, the days of the blackbird at the end of January, as the coldest of the year, a tradition rooted in centuries of bitter memory. Such sayings were not superstition alone. They were encoded experience, tools for survival disguised as culture. The wealthy also carried winter memories, though in different ways. For elites, harsh winters meant disruptions to trade, higher costs for fuel, or fear of unrest among the poor. Their diaries and letters recall shortages of wine, frozen fountains, or the inconvenience of impassable roads. These memories shaped how they viewed governance, charity, and their obligations to society. Philanthropy in the late 18th century, particularly in England and France, often drew on elite recollections of winters when poor families died in droves, inspiring efforts to organize relief more systematically. Memory could also be divisive. For the poor, winters were remembered as trials endured through suffering and solidarity. For the wealthy, they were remembered as tests of order and control. These competing memories influenced debates over poverty and reform. Enlightenment thinkers, recalling famine and disease, argued that progress must mean freedom from winter's tyranny. They envisioned a future where science, industry, and rational governance could shield populations from hunger and cold. The very concept of modernity was shaped in part by the memory of pre-modern winters. Endurance was not only about food and fuel. It was about identity. Communities prided themselves on their resilience, telling stories of how their town survived when others faltered. In rural areas, families traced lineages of survival, remembering ancestors who endured famine or revolt. In urban centers, guilds and parishes preserved records of relief given during the harshest winters, building institutional pride. These memories reinforced communal bonds, reminding each generation that they were part of a larger struggle that transcended individual lives. The Enlightenment reframed endurance in new ways. Philosophers such as Montesquieu and Rousseau reflected on climate's role in shaping societies, noting how harsh winters tested the resilience of Northern Europe. Historians and natural philosophers began to collect records of weather, mapping patterns of frost and famine. Memory became data, an early attempt to understand the natural world scientifically. This shift did not erase the human suffering of winter, but it reinterpreted it, laying groundwork for the 19th century development of meteorology and public health. By the century's end, endurance and memory had fused into reform. In Britain, societies for the relief of the poor cited past winters as justification for coal distributions. In France, revolutionaries invoked the memory of hunger to demand rights and equality. In Germany and Scandinavia, recollections of famine inspired early experiments in agricultural improvement. Winter's memory thus became a lever for change, transforming private suffering into public policy. Yet for most poor families, memory was personal and immediate. It lived in stories told by firesides, in prayers whispered at altars, and in the scars of hunger carried in bodies. Children who survived remembered the taste of bark bread or the silence of nights without candles. Adults remembered burying infants in frozen ground or rioting for loaves in icy streets. These memories were not abstract. They were lived realities that shaped decisions each autumn, each market day, each prayer. Endurance was forged in repetition, and memory ensured that survival strategies were never forgotten. The story of endurance and memory is thus the story of how communities transformed suffering into resilience. It shows how winter, relentless and unforgiving, was never endured passively but actively resisted, remembered, and reshaped into guidance. The poor of the 18th century did not merely survive winters. They wove them into the fabric of their lives, ensuring that each new generation faced a season not with ignorance, but with a hard-won wisdom of those who came before. The winters of the 18th century, brutal and unrelenting, left a legacy far beyond the snow and ice of their passing. They shaped not only bodies and households, but also economies, politics, and cultures. For Europe's poor, each winter was both a trial and a lesson, a season that tested endurance and left scars of memory. For society as a whole, the repeated crises of hunger, cold, and disease revealed the fragility of life in an age before modern technology. The legacy of these winters is not merely historical. It is a testament to the resilience of human communities when faced with forces far greater than themselves. At the most immediate level, the long winters defined demographic patterns. Mortality rates rose sharply in January and February, creating seasonal rhythms in parish registers. Entire families could vanish in a single harsh year, while communities marked by famine and epidemic carried the scars for decades. Population growth slowed or reversed in regions hardest hit, influencing migration, marriage patterns, and the distribution of labor. These demographic shifts were not temporary disruptions. They shaped the trajectory of towns, villages, and even nations. Economically, the memory of long winters reinforced the need for resilience. Agricultural reforms, such as crop rotation and improved storage, were driven by the desire to avoid famine. Landowners experimented with new techniques to ensure more reliable harvests, while governments began to establish grain reserves to stabilize prices in times of scarcity. In Britain, the expansion of the coal trade was partly fueled by the recognition that wood alone could not sustain urban populations through repeated winters. In France, memories of famine years fed demands for reform of the grain trade, a tension that would explode into the political arena by the end of the century. Politically, the legacy of winter was even more profound. Bread riots and fuel shortages revealed the volatility of hunger and the capacity of the poor to act collectively. Authorities feared the crowd as much as the frost, recognizing that winter unrest could spiral into broader revolt. The Revolution of 1789 in France, though driven by many factors, was deeply rooted in decades of bread crises and winter scarcity. The cry for bread was both literal and symbolic, linking the struggle for survival to the struggle for rights. In this sense, the legacy of winter fed directly into the era of revolution and reform that reshaped Europe. Culturally, winter left deep impressions on memory and identity. Folklore, proverbs, and songs carried forward recollections of famine and frost. Communities commemorated winters of suffering in sermons, prayers, and family stories, ensuring that each generation approached the season with caution. These cultural memories reinforced resilience but also shaped moral frameworks, framing winter survival as both a human and divine test. In Catholic regions, harsh winters were remembered as trials sent by God, demanding patience and piety. In Protestant lands, they were seen as tests of discipline and industriousness. Across confessional lines, the poor interpreted them as reminders of both vulnerability and solidarity. For the poor themselves, the legacy was intensely personal. Families carried forward scars of hunger and stunted growth, weakened health, and shortened lives. The memory of hardship shaped attitudes toward work, charity, and community. Those who had survived repeated winters learned to value resourcefulness and mutual aid, while also harbor resentment toward elites who seemed insulated from suffering. These feelings, passed down through generations, influenced not only immediate survival strategies but also broader social attitudes. The Enlightenment reframed winter's legacy through the lens of reason and science. Thinkers such as Montesquieu linked climate to the character of nations, arguing that harsh winters bred endurance. Natural philosophers began to record weather systematically, transforming memory into data. Physicians studied the links between cold, malnutrition, and disease, laying groundwork for modern public health. Winter was no longer only a season to be endured. It was also a subject to be studied, explained, and eventually mastered. This shift marked the beginning of a new relationship between humanity and nature, one in which science sought to mitigate what memory had only endured. By the late 18th century, small but significant changes were already underway. Improvement in agriculture, expansion of trade networks, and early industrialization began to weaken winter's grip. Coal canals and better roads improved supply chains, reducing the likelihood of famine in urban centers. Philanthropic societies organized more systematic relief, distributing coal and bread to the poor during harsh seasons. Inoculation against smallpox offered new defenses against winter epidemics. These developments did not erase hardship, but they marked the first cracks in the cycle that had bound Europe's poor for centuries. Yet the legacy of the long winters remained visible. Communities continued to prepare with caution, storing food and fuel in autumn, remembering the lessons of ancestors who had suffered in 1709, 1740, or 1771. The poor still entered each winter with dread, knowing that survival was never guaranteed. But they also carried forward resilience, strategies, and memories that gave meaning to endurance. Winter remained a crucible, but it was also a teacher, reminding societies of both their limits and their possibilities. The broader legacy of the 18th century's winters lies in the recognition that poverty was not an individual failing, but a structural condition. Harsh seasons revealed how deeply inequality shaped survival. The poor bore the brunt of hunger, disease, and exposure, while the wealthy shielded themselves with bulk supplies, charity, and privilege. Winter laid bare these divisions, forcing society to confront the moral and political questions they raised. Out of this confrontation emerged debates about rights, reforms, and the role of the state, debates that would define the modern age. The long winters of the past are gone, but their legacy endures in memory and in history. They remind us of the fragility of human life before the age of modern heating, medicine, and global trade. They remind us of the resilience of communities who endured with little more than ingenuity and solidarity. And they remind us that inequality, as much as climate, determines who survives hardship. The story of Europe's poor in the 18th century is thus not only a story of suffering, but also a story of endurance, adaptation, and the seeds of change. Winter, in its silence and severity, shaped the world we live in today. Its legacy is carved not only into the graves of those who perished, but also into the reforms, institutions, and memories that followed. The 18th century's poor left behind no monuments, but their endurance was itself a monument to the resilience of humanity against the long, cold night.